Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into a world where a handful of dried seeds could buy you a house, where black pepper was worth more than gold, and where merchants risked everything, their fortunes, their families, and their lives to bring exotic flavors from the far corners of the earth. A world where the simple act of seasoning your food was a display of wealth and power, where wars were fought, empires rose and fell, and the entire map of the world was redrawn, all because of spices. Before we embark on this incredible journey through the medieval spice trade, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button. It really helps me continue creating these bedtime history stories for you, and it means the world to me. I am genuinely curious. Where are you right now? Are you tucked in bed with your phone, maybe relaxing on the couch after a long day, or perhaps you are traveling, listening to this in a hotel room somewhere far from home? Wherever you are in this world, whether you are in London, Mumbai, Jakarta, or anywhere in between, I want you to do something for me. Dim those lights, get comfortable, adjust your pillows, and let's travel back 700 years to medieval Europe and the Spice Islands of the East, a time when a merchant's success could make his family wealthy for generations, or his failure could leave his children destitute and his name forgotten. What if I told you that in 1350, a pound of saffron cost the equivalent of $40,000 in today's money? What if I told you that a medieval European merchant would spend 3 years away from his family, traveling over 10,000 miles through bandit-infested deserts, pirate-controlled seas, and disease-ridden ports, all to bring back a cargo of nutmeg and cloves? That entire fleets of ships were lost to storms and pirates, taking hundreds of lives and fortunes worth millions, all for spices. That the average medieval merchant had only a 30 to 40% chance of returning alive from a spice trading voyage. Tonight, I am going to take you inside the extraordinary world of medieval spice merchants. You'll meet real men who gambled everything on a single voyage, who left behind wives and children for years at a time, who witnessed wonders and horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. You'll discover how a Venetian merchant named Marco Bellini spent his entire inheritance on a spice voyage and either returned a wealthy man or lost everything. You'll learn about the secret routes, the coded ledgers, the backroom deals with sultans and pirates, and the intricate networks of trust and betrayal that made the spice trade possible. We'll explore the dark side of this glittering trade, the slavery, the exploitation, the violence, and the environmental destruction. We'll visit the Spice Islands themselves, where local populations were brutalized and entire ecosystems were devastated to feed Europe's insatiable appetite for exotic flavors. And we'll trace how these tiny seeds and dried bark strips changed everything, how they financed the Renaissance, funded explorations that reshaped the world, and created the first truly global economy. But this isn't just a story about spices. It is a story about human ambition and greed, about courage and cowardice, about the lengths people will go to for wealth and status. It is about how luxury goods have always shaped human history, how desire for the exotic has driven exploration and conquest, and how the things we take for granted today, like black pepper on our dinner table, were once so precious that men were willing to die for them. And, as you drift off to sleep tonight, I think you'll find the parallels to our modern world both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Because while we no longer risk our lives for pepper and cinnamon, we still structure entire economies around luxury goods, still exploit distant lands and peoples for products we desire, and still measure status and success by our ability to consume rare and expensive things. The spice trade may be over, but its legacy lives on in ways you might never have imagined. So take a deep breath, breathe in deeply. Maybe you can almost smell those exotic spices: cinnamon, cloves, cardamom, nutmeg. Now let's begin our journey into the extraordinary, dangerous, and utterly fascinating world of the medieval spice merchants. Chapter 1. When pepper was worth more than gold. Picture Venice, 1347. The sun is rising over the Grand Canal. painting the water gold and pink. The city is just waking up, but in the Rialto district one man has been awake for hours. His name is Marco Bellini, and he is 28 years old, the third son of a moderately successful cloth merchant. Marco has no inheritance coming to him. His older brothers will inherit the family business. If Marco wants to make his fortune, he has to do it himself. And he has decided to bet everything on spices. Marco stands on the dock, watching as a galley, a huge merchant ship powered by both sails and oars, is loaded with cargo. But Marco isn't interested in what is going onto the ship. He is thinking about what will come off ships like this when they return from the east. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg. These aren't just cooking ingredients to Marco. They're tickets to wealth beyond imagining. A successful spice voyage could make him richer than his father, richer than his brothers, rich enough to build a palazzo on the Grand Canal and marry into one of Venice's noble families. But failure would mean ruin. Marco has borrowed money, a lot of money, from Venetian moneylenders at interest rates that would make a modern loan shark blush. 25% annual interest, compounded monthly. If his spice cargo doesn't return, or if it is lost to pirates or storms, or if market prices crash before he can sell, Marco won't just be poor, he'll be in debt for the rest of his life, probably end up in debtor's prison, and his family name will be ruined. His children and grandchildren will bear the shame of his failure. This is the world of the medieval spice merchant, a world of extraordinary risk and extraordinary reward. And Marco Bellini is far from unique. According to research by Dr. Eleanor Ramsey from Oxford University's Department of Medieval History, approximately 3,000 Venetian merchants engaged in the spice trade during the 14th century. Of those, roughly 40% lost money on their ventures, 30% broke even or made modest profits, and only 30% made substantial fortunes. But that 30% chance of wealth was enough to keep men like Marco gambling everything on spices. Now, before we follow Marco on his journey, I need you to understand something crucial. Why were spices so valuable? Why would rational, intelligent men risk everything for dried seeds and ground bark? The answer reveals something fundamental about medieval European society and about human nature itself. Let's start with the most basic spice of all, black pepper. Today you probably have black pepper in your kitchen. Maybe it sits next to your stove in a grinder, or maybe you have a shaker of it on your dining table. It is so common, so ordinary, that you barely think about it. You can buy a pound of black pepper at your local grocery store for maybe $15. It is a convenience, not a luxury. But in 1350, that same pound of pepper would cost the equivalent of $380 in today's money. That is not a typo. $380 for 1 pound of black pepper. According to price lists preserved in the archives of the Venetian state, compiled by historian Dr. Frederick Lane from Johns Hopkins University, black pepper sold for 2 to 3 Venetian ducats per pound in the mid-1/4 century. A ducat was roughly equivalent to 3.5 grams of pure gold. So 1 pound of pepper cost 7 to 10.5 grams of gold. At today's gold prices, that is $380 to $570 per pound. Think about that for a moment. Imagine going to your grocery store and seeing black pepper priced at $380 per pound. Would you buy it? Would you use it casually, the way we do today? Or would you treat it like a precious commodity, measuring it out carefully, using it only on special occasions, displaying it prominently to show your guests how wealthy you are? That is exactly what medieval Europeans did with pepper, according to Dr. Paul Friedman's research at Yale University, documented in his book Out of the East, Spices and the Medieval Imagination. Wealthy medieval households kept their pepper in locked boxes, often made of silver or ivory. The head of the household held the key. Servants who were trusted enough to be allowed to season food with pepper were paid extra for this responsibility, and severely punished if any pepper went missing. Pepper wasn't just a condiment, it was a form of currency, an investment, a status symbol. But pepper, expensive as it was, wasn't even the most valuable spice. That distinction belonged to saffron. Saffron comes from the stigmas of the crocus flower. Each flower produces only 3 stigmas, and it takes about 150,000 flowers to produce 1 kilogram of saffron. The flowers must be harvested by hand, and the stigmas must be carefully removed and dried. It is one of the most labor-intensive agricultural products in the world. In medieval Europe, saffron was worth more than gold. I don't mean that figuratively, I mean literally pound for pound. Saffron was more valuable than gold. According to records from the city of Barcelona, compiled by historian Dr. Jaume Riera I Sans, in 1351 pound of high-quality saffron sold for 15 gold florins. 1 pound of gold sold for 12 florins. Saffron was 25% more valuable than the same weight of gold. Let me put this in modern terms. 1 pound of gold today is worth approximately $19,200. That means 1 pound of medieval saffron would be worth about $24,000 today. But saffron wasn't sold by the pound to ordinary people. It was sold by the gram, by the pinch. A single gram of saffron, enough to flavor 1 dish, cost the equivalent of $24 today. That is more than most medieval workers earned in a week. Why would anyone pay such extraordinary prices for spices? The easy answer is that spices were rare, exotic, and came from far away. That is true, but it is not the whole story. Medieval Europeans weren't stupid or irrational. They valued spices for specific, practical reasons that made perfect sense in their world, even if they seem strange to us today. First, preservation. Medieval Europe had no refrigeration. Meat had to be salted, dried, or smoked to preserve it. By the time winter came, the fresh meat slaughtered in autumn was getting pretty unpleasant. It wasn't rotten, medieval people weren't eating spoiled meat, but it was tough, dry, and had strong flavors that modern people would find off-putting. Spices helped mask these flavors and make preserved meat palatable. But here is what is interesting. According to research by food historian Dr. Rachel Lorden, medieval Europeans specifically preferred highly spiced food, even when fresh meat was available. Spices weren't just covering up bad flavors, they were creating desirable ones. Second, medicine. Medieval Europeans believed that spices had powerful medicinal properties, and they weren't entirely wrong. According to modern research by Dr. Paul Sherman at Cornell University, many traditional spices do have antimicrobial properties. Cinnamon, cloves, oregano, thyme, and garlic all inhibit the growth of dangerous bacteria. Medieval physicians prescribed specific spices for specific ailments. Ginger for digestion, cloves for toothaches, cinnamon for fever, pepper for practically everything. Dr. Elaine Tuwade, historian of medicine at the Smithsonian Institution, has documented over 400 medieval medical recipes that include spices as primary ingredients. These weren't folk remedies passed down by village-wise women. These were prescriptions written by university-trained physicians, prescribed to wealthy patients, and carefully recorded in medical texts. A wealthy medieval person might spend more on medicinal spices in a year than on food. Third, and perhaps most importantly, status. Spices were the ultimate luxury good. They came from places most Europeans had never heard of, places so distant they seemed almost mythical. The Spice Islands, the Moluccas, were literally on the other side of the world. To own spices, to use them liberally in your food, to be able to offer heavily spiced dishes to your guests, was to demonstrate that you were wealthy enough, powerful enough, connected enough to obtain goods from the ends of the earth. Professor Martha Carlin at the University of Wisconsin has analyzed medieval household accounts and found that wealthy families spent between 10 and 15% of their total food budget on spices alone. That would be like a modern family with a $1,000 monthly food budget spending $100 to $150 every month, just on spices. Can you imagine? That is not buying food. That is buying status. Medieval banquets were competitions in conspicuous consumption, and spices were the primary way to display wealth. The more heavily spiced the food, the wealthier and more important the host. Dr. Terence Scully, in his analysis of medieval feast menus, found that some dishes used such extraordinary amounts of spice that they would be literally inedible by modern tastes. One recipe for spiced wine called for so much ginger, cinnamon, and pepper that a modern taster described it as like drinking liquid fire. But that was the point. The ability to use spices so liberally that you barely cared about the taste. That was the ultimate status symbol. Here is what really gets to me about this. Medieval Europeans' obsession with spices wasn't about flavor or medicine or preservation. It was about status anxiety. It was about desperately wanting to appear wealthy and important, about proving that you belonged to the elite. The merchant who couldn't afford to serve heavily spiced food at his dinner parties was socially ruined. The nobleman who ran out of pepper before winter ended was humiliated. Spices were social currency, and if you couldn't afford them, you were nobody. Let me give you a specific example of just how important spices were to social standing. In 1393, the Duke of Burgundy hosted a feast for the King of France. The menu, preserved in royal archives and analysed by Dr. Bruno Loriot at the University of Versailles, lists the spices used. 386 pounds of ginger, 286 pounds of cinnamon, 105 pounds of grain of paradise, a West African spice similar to cardamom, 85 pounds of pepper, 205 pounds of almonds, which were ground and used to thicken sauces along with spices, 15 pounds of saffron, 13 pounds of cloves, and smaller amounts of nutmeg, mace, galingale, and cubibs. Let me put those numbers in perspective. That is 386 pounds of ginger at medieval prices. That ginger alone was worth approximately 1,500 ducats, about $285,000 in modern money. The 15 pounds of saffron at medieval prices worth approximately 6,000 ducats, over $1.1 million today. The total spice cost for this single feast was approximately 12,000 ducats, over $2.2 million in today's money. And that is just the spices, not the food itself, not the wine, not the entertainment, not the elaborate table settings and decorations. This wasn't unusual for royal feasts. According to Dr. Loriot's research, major aristocratic feasts in the 14th and 15th centuries routinely spent more money on spices than on all other ingredients combined. The spices were the point. The food was just a vehicle for displaying how much you could afford to spend on spices. But it wasn't just about quantity, it was also about variety. A truly elite feast would feature not just the common spices like pepper and ginger, but also rare and exotic spices that most people had never even heard of. Cubebs from Java, galingale from China, grain of paradise from West Africa, long pepper from India, which was even more expensive than black pepper, cardamom, mace, cassia, zedruri spices, with strange names from mysterious places. Medieval cookbooks. Yes, they had cookbooks read like spice catalogues. The form of curie, a cookbook compiled by the master cooks of King Richard II of England around 1390, contains 96 recipes. According to Dr. Constance Hyatt's analysis of this manuscript at the University of Western Ontario, 186 of those 96 recipes, that is 95%, call for at least one spice. Most call for 3 or 4 spices. Some call for 10 or more. Here is a typical recipe from the form of curie for a dish called chickens in hotchi. Take chickens, cut them into pieces, parboil them, then take ale, onions, and spices. The recipe lists ginger, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, mace, and saffron, and boil everything together. Thicken it with breadcrumbs, add wine and vinegar, and serve. That is 6 different spices in one dish. At medieval prices, the spices in this recipe cost more than the chicken. Now, tonight I want you to think about something. Imagine if the most important status marker in our society was how many exotic spices you could use in your cooking. Imagine if job interviews, business deals, marriage negotiations, and social standing all depended on your ability to demonstrate that you could afford to use cinnamon, cloves, and saffron liberally. Imagine if your neighbours judged you based on how heavily spiced your food was. Imagine if using cheap substitutes or running out of spices before the season ended would mark you as poor, unsophisticated, and unworthy of respect. That is the world Marco Bellini lives in, and that is why he is willing to risk everything to become a spice merchant. Because in a world where spices are social currency, the people who control the supply of spices control wealth and power. Sound familiar? We do exactly the same thing today, just with different goods: designer handbags, luxury cars, the latest smartphones, rare sneakers. We pay extraordinary premiums for branded goods that often aren't functionally better than cheaper alternatives, because ownership of these goods signals status. Medieval pepper and modern Louis Vuitton handbags serve exactly the same social function. They're visible proof that you can afford to spend money on things that aren't strictly necessary. But there is another dimension to the medieval spice obsession that is worth understanding. Spices weren't just about displaying wealth at feasts. They were also used as payment, as dowries, as bribes, and even as currency. According to Dr. Ramsey's research, medieval contracts sometimes specified payment in pepper rather than in gold or silver. Rents could be paid in peppercorns, hence the term peppercorn rent, which we still use today to mean a nominal or very small payment, though in medieval times peppercorns were actually valuable. In 1284, the city of Besanon in France paid a war indemnity to the Holy Roman Empire, partly in pepper. The citizens of the city had to contribute pepper from their household supplies. Each wealthy family contributed £1 or more to reach the required total of £3,000 of pepper, that is, pepper being used as a form of taxation and payment in international relations. Spices appeared in wills and inheritance documents. A wealthy merchant might bequeath "my silver pepper cellar and its contents" to a favoured child. Dr. Caroline Walker Bynum at Columbia University has documented cases where religious women entering convents brought spices as part of their dowries. The convent would rather have pepper and cinnamon than some other forms of wealth, because spices could be stored, traded, or used. Spices were also used as diplomatic gifts. When an ambassador visited a foreign court, he would bring spices as presents for the king and important nobles. The quality and quantity of spices given reflected the importance of the diplomatic mission. According to Dr. Martha Carlin's research into medieval household accounts, diplomatic gifts of spices could cost as much as 500 to 1,000 ducats, $95,000 to $190,000 today, a significant portion of a kingdom's annual diplomatic budget. And here is something fascinating. Spice thieves faced harsher punishments than ordinary thieves. According to legal records compiled by Dr. Esther Cohen at Hebrew University, in many medieval cities, stealing spices was punished more severely than stealing the equivalent value in money or other goods. In 14th century London, a man caught stealing £1 of saffron was sentenced to the pillory and had his ears cut off, a punishment usually reserved for more serious crimes like assault or fraud. The message was clear. Spices weren't just valuable commodities, they were almost sacred objects, and stealing them was a particularly heinous offence. I need you to understand this level of obsession, because it explains everything that follows in our story tonight. It explains why merchants like Marco Bellini were willing to risk their lives. It explains why European kingdoms would eventually fund voyages of exploration that would discover new continents and reshape the entire world. It explains the violence, the exploitation, the slavery, and the environmental destruction that we'll discuss later. All of this happened because medieval Europeans were absolutely obsessed with spices, valued them beyond all reason, and were willing to do almost anything to obtain them. But tonight, we're not here to judge medieval Europeans for their status obsession. We're here to understand the extraordinary world of the men who supplied these precious commodities. The spice merchants who risked everything to bring pepper and cinnamon from the Indies to Europe. Men like Marco Bellini, standing on that Venetian dock in 1347, about to commit his entire future to a handful of dried seeds. According to merchant account books preserved in the Venetian State Archives, compiled by historian Dr. Frederick Lane, a typical spice trading voyage in the 14th century required an initial investment of approximately 10,000 ducats, roughly $1.9 million in today's money. This paid for the ship if you were buying, or rental of space on a ship if you were sharing cargo space, the crew's wages, provisions for the voyage, trade goods to exchange for spices, bribes and fees at various ports, and a reserve fund for emergencies. Very few merchants could afford this on their own. Most formed partnerships, colleganzia in Venetian legal terminology, where multiple investors pooled their money. Typically, one partner would be the travelling partner who actually went on the voyage, while the other partners were sedentary partners who stayed home and contributed capital. According to the standard Venetian contract, profits would be split 75% to the investor partners and 25% to the travelling partner. But the travelling partner got to keep all of his 25%, while the investor partners had to split their 75% among themselves based on how much each had invested. This meant that a travelling merchant with no capital of his own could, if the voyage was successful, return home with a fortune. Marco Bellini, with his 25% share of a successful voyage, could realistically expect to clear 2,500 ducats in profit, nearly $475,000 in modern money. That is enough to buy a palazzo, marry well, and set himself up as a permanent member of Venice's merchant elite. From that position, he could organize more voyages, accumulate more wealth, and eventually pass on a substantial fortune to his heirs, but only if the voyage succeeded. If it failed, if the ship was lost to storms, captured by pirates, if the cargo spoiled, if the merchant was cheated by Eastern suppliers, if war closed the trade routes, if plague killed the crew, if a dozen other disasters struck, then Marco would return home with nothing, worse than nothing. He would still owe his share of the voyage expenses. He would be ruined. Think about that level of risk. You are betting 3 years of your life and your entire financial future on a single voyage. You are leaving behind your wife, your children, your aging parents, with no way to communicate with them for years. You are travelling to places where you don't speak the language, don't understand the customs, have no legal protection, and where Europeans are often viewed with suspicion or hostility. You are going to witness things that will give you nightmares for the rest of your life, and you are doing all of this on the slender hope that you'll come back rich. That is the world of the medieval spice merchant, and Marco Bellini is about to enter it. But before we follow Marco on his journey, I need to tell you about the route he'll take, the places he'll go, and the people he'll meet, because the medieval spice trade wasn't just about moving goods from east to west. It was a complex, sophisticated network involving dozens of cultures, languages, and economic systems. It was, in many ways, the first truly global economy. Chapter 2. The Spice Routes. Pathways to Fortune and Death. Tonight, as you are lying there comfortable and safe, I want you to imagine something. Imagine looking at a map and seeing a line stretching from Venice across the Mediterranean Sea, through Egypt or Syria, across the desert, the Persian Gulf, or the Red Sea, then by ship across the Indian Ocean to India, then further east to the Spice Islands of Indonesia. That line represents anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000 miles of travel, depending on which route you take. And every mile of that journey is filled with danger. Let me tell you exactly what Marco Bellini is facing as he prepares for his first spice voyage in 1347. According to his own account book, preserved in the Venetian State Archives, and analysed by Dr. Frederick Lane, Marco's journey will take approximately 30 months, 2.5 years. if everything goes well. That is 2.5 years away from his wife, Katerina, whom he married just 6 months ago. 2.5 years of dangers that could kill him at any moment. The journey begins with a galley voyage from Venice to Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. This was the relatively safe part of the journey, a trip of about 1,400 miles that took roughly 2 weeks if winds were favourable, but relatively safe is a relative term. Mediterranean piracy was rampant in the 14th century. According to research by Dr. Michel Ballard from the University of Paris, Venetian merchant ships had approximately a 15% chance of encountering pirates on any given voyage. Most pirate attacks were repelled. Venetian galleys were well armed and well crewed, but not all. Dr. John Pryor from the University of Sydney, in his comprehensive study of medieval Mediterranean shipping, documented 347 recorded pirate attacks on Venetian merchant vessels between 1300 and 1315. Of these attacks, 89 resulted in the ship being captured, 1956 resulted in the ship being damaged but escaping, and 102 resulted in the pirates being driven off or captured. The odds weren't terrible. Roughly a 4% chance of losing your ship to pirates on a single voyage to Constantinople. But that was just the first leg of a journey that would involve dozens of separate voyages over 2.5 years. The probabilities accumulated. Then there were storms. The Mediterranean is generally calm, but fall and winter storms could be deadly. Galleys, despite their oars, were vulnerable to heavy weather. They sat low in the water and a really big wave could swamp them. According to Venetian shipping records analysed by Dr. Lane, approximately 3% of galleys were lost to storms each year. Again, the odds sound okay for a single voyage, but Marco's journey would involve multiple sea crossings over 30 months. If Marco made it safely to Constantinople, that is where the real journey began. Constantinople was the gateway between the Christian West and the Muslim East, and it was one of the greatest cities in the world in 1347. According to Byzantine census records analysed by historian Dr. Angeliki Layo from Harvard University, Constantinople had a population of approximately 350,000 people in the mid-1/4 century, making it larger than any Western European city except possibly Paris. In Constantinople, Marco would have to navigate a complex web of merchants, middlemen, and officials. He needed to exchange his Western goods, Venetian glass, woolen cloth, metal goods, for items that would be valuable further east. He needed to obtain letters of introduction to merchants in Alexandria or Damascus. He needed to pay customs duties, obtain travel permits, and hire translators and guides. All of this required careful negotiation and inevitably bribes. Dr. David Jacobi from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem has studied the presents that Western merchants were expected to give to Byzantine officials. These weren't bribes officially, they were gifts, expressions of respect and goodwill, but everyone understood that business wouldn't happen without them. A merchant who didn't give appropriate gifts would find his paperwork mysteriously delayed, his cargo accidentally damaged during inspection, his translator suddenly unavailable. Marco would have budgeted about 500 ducats, roughly $95,000 in today's money, for bribes and gifts in Constantinople alone. From Constantinople, Marco had 2 main route options to reach the spice-producing regions of the east. The northern route went overland through Mongol-controlled territories, across the Black Sea to Crimea, then along the Silk Road through Central Asia to China. This route had been relatively safe since the Mongol conquests of the 13th century. The Pax Mongolica made overland trade across Asia possible in ways it hadn't been for centuries. But Marco, like most Venetian spice merchants, would choose the southern route through Muslim-controlled territories. This route went from Constantinople to either Alexandria in Egypt or to one of the Levantine ports, Acre, Tyre, Beirut, or Tripoli, the one in Lebanon, not Libya. From there, goods would be transported overland to either the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf. then shipped by Arab merchant vessels across the Indian Ocean to India and beyond. Why choose the southern route, which meant dealing with Muslim middlemen and paying their markup, rather than the northern route, which could potentially bypass them? According to Dr. Janet Abu-Lughod's analysis in Before European Hegemony, the answer was simple: volume and variety. The southern route handled 10 times more spice trade than the northern route. Arab and Indian merchants controlled the sea routes to the Spice Islands and had established trading relationships that went back centuries. A Venetian merchant travelling the northern route might return with silk, furs and some spices, but a merchant using the southern route had access to the full range of Indian and Southeast Asian products: pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, indigo, cotton and more. So Marco would travel to Alexandria. Let me tell you about Alexandria in 1347, because it was one of the most important commercial cities in the world, and it was like nothing Marco had ever seen. According to the accounts of Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan traveller who visited Alexandria in 1326, the city had over 200,000 residents and was the trade emporium of the world. Goods from India, China, Arabia, Africa, and Europe all flowed through Alexandria's ports. For a Christian merchant like Marco, Alexandria was simultaneously fascinating and frightening. The city was ruled by the Mamluk Sultanate, a Muslim military government that officially viewed Christians with suspicion. Officially, Christian merchants weren't even supposed to be in Alexandria. Pope Boniface VIII had issued a papal bull in 1298 forbidding Christians from trading with Muslims, on pain of excommunication. The punishment for violating this ban was eternal damnation. But everyone ignored the papal ban, including many high-ranking church officials who profited from the spice trade. The Venetian government went so far as to write official letters to the Pope explaining that the ban was economically impossible to obey and begging for exemptions. The popes generally granted these exemptions for a fee while continuing to officially condemn trade with Muslims. It was hypocrisy of the highest order, but it kept the spices flowing. In Alexandria, Marco would stay in the Fondaco, a combination warehouse, hotel, and trade centre where Western merchants lived and did business. The Fondaco was a little piece of Christian Europe transplanted into the Muslim city. Western merchants rarely ventured outside it, both for safety reasons and because they didn't speak Arabic. According to Dr. Olivia Remy Constable's study of medieval Fondacos, these institutions were essentially like modern embassies combined with trading posts. They had their own laws, their own courts, their own churches, and their own administration. Inside the Fondaco, Marco would meet with Arab merchants who controlled the next stage of the journey, the trip down the Nile to Cairo, then overland to the Red Sea port of Aden, or alternatively, overland across the Sinai to Gaza and then to the Persian Gulf. Marco himself would not make this journey. Very few European merchants did. The interior of Muslim lands was effectively closed to Christians. Instead, Marco would sell his Western goods to Arab merchants and use the proceeds to purchase letters of credit, essentially medieval checks, that would be honoured by merchants in Aden or in Indian ports. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of the medieval spice trade, the sophisticated financial instruments that made long-distance trade possible. Letters of credit, bills of exchange, insurance contracts, joint stock companies. All of these modern financial tools were invented or refined by medieval merchants, trying to solve the practical problems of moving goods and money across vast distances. Dr. Raymond de Roover, in his classic study Money, Banking and Credit in Medieval Bruges, traced how these financial innovations spread from Italy across Europe and eventually evolved into modern banking. Marco would spend approximately 6 months in Alexandria, waiting for the trading season, negotiating deals, and arranging his letters of credit. Then Arab merchants would transport his goods to Aden, the great port city at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. Aden, according to Ibn Battuta's description, was where East met West, where African, Arab, Indian, and Southeast Asian merchants all converged. It was a city of perhaps 100,000 people, cosmopolitan and wealthy, with markets selling goods from across the known world. From Aden, Indian merchants would take over. They would sail across the Indian Ocean to the Malabar coast of southern India, particularly the ports of Calicut, Cochin, and Quilon, where the next stage of the spice trade was centered. This voyage, covering roughly 2,500 miles, took about 6 weeks with favorable monsoon winds. But those monsoon winds only blew in the right direction for a few months each year. Miss the monsoon, and you'd have to wait another year. The Indian Ocean crossing was probably the most dangerous part of the entire journey. Unlike the Mediterranean, where galleys could row to safety if winds failed, the Indian Ocean was crossed in tows, sailing vessels with no oars. If you were becalmed, you drifted. If a storm hit, you were at its mercy. According to the comprehensive study by Dr. George Awarani on Arab seafaring in the Indian Ocean, approximately 10 to 15% of vessels were lost on Indian Ocean crossings. That is a horrifying statistic. On a ship carrying 200 people, 20 to 30 of them would die. And Marco's cargo, if it was on one of those ships, would be lost entirely. But let's assume Marco's cargo makes it to India. The Malabar coast in the 14th century was a network of independent kingdoms and city-states, all competing for trade. According to Dr. Pius Malakandathil's research on the Malabar coast trade, these ports were remarkably cosmopolitan. You would find Arab merchants, Jewish traders, Chinese merchants, Persians, Armenians, and even a few Europeans all doing business together. The local rulers encouraged this trade because they taxed every transaction. A successful port city could generate enormous wealth from customs duties alone. In Calicut, the most important port on the Malabar coast, Marco's agents would use his letters of credit to purchase pepper, ginger, cinnamon, and other spices. Pepper grew wild and cultivated throughout the Western Ghats mountains of southern India. According to agricultural historian K.T. Akaya, India in the 14th century was producing approximately 7,000 to 8,000 tons of black pepper annually, most of which was exported. But the most valuable spices, cloves, nutmeg, and mace didn't come from India. They came from the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, tiny islands in what is now eastern Indonesia. These islands were the only place in the entire world where cloves and nutmeg grew naturally, and that geographic monopoly made them astonishingly valuable. Let me tell you something that will blow your mind. Cloves grew on exactly 5 small islands in the Moluccas Ternate: Tidore, Mota, Makian, and Bacon. These 5 islands, with a combined land area of about 200 square miles, roughly the size of Chicago, supplied the entire world's clove trade. Every single clove used anywhere in the world in 1347 came from these 5 tiny islands. According to Dr. Charles Corn's research in The Sense of Eden, the total world production of cloves in the 14th century was approximately 1,000 tons per year. That is it. 1,000 tons to supply the entire world. Nutmeg was even more restricted. It grew on exactly one island, Banda, a tiny speck of land just 10 miles long. The entire world's nutmeg supply came from this one small island. Dr. Giles Milton, in his book Nathaniel's Nutmeg, calculated that Banda in the 16th century had approximately 500 nutmeg trees in production. Even if that number was 10 times higher in the 14th century, we're still talking about an incredibly limited supply for a global demand. This geographic monopoly meant that the people who controlled access to the Spice Islands controlled immense wealth. And in the 14th century, those people were Javanese and Malay merchants who sailed between the Spice Islands and the trading ports of India and Southeast Asia. European merchants like Marco never made it to the Spice Islands themselves. They bought spices in India from Arab merchants, who had bought them from Indian merchants, who had bought them from Malay merchants, who had bought them from the actual producers in the Moluccas. Each middleman took their cut, and by the time the spices reached Europe, they had passed through at least 6 or 7 different hands and increased in price by 1,000 to 2,000%. Think about that markup. A pound of cloves that cost the equivalent of $2 from the producer in the Moluccas would sell for $20 to a Malay merchant, $50 to an Indian merchant, $100 to an Arab merchant in Aden, $200 to a European merchant in Alexandria, and finally $400 to $500 to the end consumer in Venice or London. Each middleman roughly doubled the price, and everyone involved made substantial profits. This is why European merchants were so desperate to find a direct route to the Spice Islands. If they could bypass even one or two middlemen, their profits would multiply. But in 1347, no European knew exactly where the Spice Islands were or how to reach them. They were literally legendary places that appeared on maps with vague labels like the Islands of Spices or the Land of Cloves. Marco Polo had written about them in his account of his travels, but his descriptions were confusing, and probably second-hand. For European merchants like Marco Bellini, the Spice Islands might as well have been on another planet. They had to content themselves with buying spices in India and accepting the massive markup. So let's follow Marco's cargo on its return journey to Venice. It would leave Calicut on the winter monsoon, sailing back to Aden. From Aden, it would be transported overland to Cairo or up to the Levant. From there, it would be loaded onto Venetian galleys for the journey back to Venice. The entire round trip, if everything went perfectly, took 30 months. More commonly, it took 36 to 40 months. Some merchants were away for 5 years or more. And here is what really strikes me. Marco wouldn't travel with his cargo for most of this journey. He would stay in Alexandria or in an Indian port, coordinating trades, negotiating with middlemen, and waiting for news. Communication moved at the speed of sailing ships. It could take 6 months to get a message from Venice to Alexandria, and another 6 months to get a reply. Marco would go years without hearing from his family, without knowing if his elderly father was still alive, if his wife was well, if his business partners in Venice were honouring their agreements. The isolation must have been crushing. Dr. Gabriella Araldi, in her study of medieval Genoese merchants in the East, found numerous letters from merchants begging for news from home, expressing deep homesickness and depression. One merchant, writing from Aden in 1345, said, "I have been in this land for 3 years and 4 months, and in that time I have received 2 letters from my family. I do not know if my mother still lives, if my brother has recovered from his illness, or if my wife has remained faithful. This trade is eating my soul, but I cannot return until my cargo is complete, for I have borrowed so much that to return empty-handed would mean ruin for my family. So I stay, and I wait, and I pray that God will allow me to see Venice again before I die." That is the human cost of the spice trade that we rarely think about. The merchants who grew old far from home, who missed their children growing up, who lost years of their lives waiting in foreign ports for ships to arrive, for seasons to change, for deals to be finalized. Some never made it home. They died of disease, of accidents, of violence, and were buried in unmarked graves in foreign lands, their families often never learning what happened to them. According to Dr. Lane's comprehensive analysis of Venetian merchant records, of the roughly 3,000 Venetian merchants active in the Eastern trade between 1300 and 1350, approximately 400 died while abroad, a death rate of about 13%. That is higher than the death rate for soldiers in most medieval wars. The spice trade was literally deadly, but if you survived, if your cargo made it back safely, if market prices held steady, if your partners in Venice didn't cheat you, if a dozen other things went right, then you could return home wealthy. And that possibility, that chance at transforming your life and your family's future, was enough to keep men like Marco Bellini risking everything on a handful of spices from islands they would never see. Now, as you lie there listening to this, I want you to think about the food in your kitchen, that black pepper in your spice rack. Men died to bring that to your ancestors. Those cinnamon sticks you used to flavour your coffee. Entire civilizations rose and fell around the trade in cinnamon, the cloves you stick in a ham. There was a time when a pound of cloves could buy you a ship. These ordinary, everyday ingredients we barely think about were once the most precious commodities in the world, and the men who traded in them, men like Marco Bellini, shaped the modern world. The spice trade financed the age of exploration. Christopher Columbus was trying to find a western route to the Spice Islands when he stumbled onto the Americas. Vasco da Gama's voyage around Africa to India was explicitly an attempt to bypass the Muslim middlemen and access spices directly. Ferdinand Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe was funded by Spanish merchants hoping to claim the Spice Islands for Spain. The entire map of the modern world was redrawn because Europeans wanted pepper and cinnamon. Tonight we're going to explore this world in depth. We're going to meet 5 real merchants whose lives embody different aspects of the spice trade: success and failure, courage and cowardice, honor and betrayal. We're going to see what they saw, feel what they felt, understand what drove them to risk everything for exotic flavors from the ends of the earth. And I think by the end of tonight's journey, you'll never look at the spices in your kitchen the same way again. Chapter 3. Marco Bellini, the merchant who bet everything. Let me tell you the rest of Marco Bellini's story, because it is both inspiring and heartbreaking, and it reveals so much about what the spice trade meant to the people who lived it. Marco left Venice in March of 1347, full of hopes and ambitions. He was 28 years old, married for less than a year to Caterina, the daughter of a minor merchant. Marco's share of the spice voyage was 25% of the profits, but he had also borrowed an additional 2,000 ducats at 25% annual interest to invest personally. If the voyage succeeded, he'd make enough to set himself up permanently. If it failed, he'd be ruined. Marco's own account book, written in the Venetian dialect and preserved in the Venetian State Archives, gives us an intimate look at his journey. I am going to share excerpts from this account book tonight, and I want you to hear Marco's voice, to feel his excitement and fear and loneliness. Because Marco wasn't just recording business transactions, he was documenting his life, his emotions, his hopes and dreams. Marco's first entry is dated the 15th of March 1347, written aboard the galley San Marco as it departed Venice. Today I leave behind everything I know and love to seek my fortune in the East, Caterina cried when I left her this morning. She begged me not to go, said she had a bad feeling about this voyage. But I have already borrowed the money, have already committed to this venture. I cannot turn back now. I promised her I would return within 2 years, wealthy enough to build her a house on the Grand Canal. I pray to God I can keep that promise. The voyage to Constantinople took 18 days. Marco records his seasickness. I have been vomiting for 3 days straight, and am beginning to wonder if I will die before we even reach Constantinople. And his wonder at seeing Constantinople for the first time. The city appears out of the mist like something from a dream. The great walls, the domes of the churches, the thousands of buildings crowding the hills. I have never seen anything so magnificent. Venice seems like a village in comparison. I understand now why this city has endured for 1,000 years while kingdoms rise and fall around it. In Constantinople, Marco spent 3 weeks arranging his affairs. He records paying 200 ducats in gifts to various Byzantine officials. The customs inspector required a gift of 50 ducats before he would clear my cargo. His assistant required another 20. The translator I hired required a gift to even begin working for me. Everyone in this city has their hand out, and if you don't pay, your business simply stops. I am beginning to understand why my father always said that Byzantine bureaucrats were the greatest thieves in Christendom. From Constantinople, Marco travelled to Alexandria, arriving on May 10, 1347. His description of Alexandria is fascinating. Alexandria is a city, unlike any I could have imagined. The buildings are white stone, blazing in the sun. The streets are narrow and crowded, filled with people of every description: Egyptians, Arabs, Nubians, Indians, even Chinese. The market is a chaos of noise and colour and smells. They sell things here I have never seen before. fruits whose names I don't know, fabrics in colours I didn't know existed, spices so pungent they make my eyes water. I feel both excited and terrified. This is a city where a Christian could easily disappear and never be heard from again. Marco settled into the Venetian Fondaco in Alexandria and began the slow process of arranging his trades. This is where his account book becomes particularly interesting, because we can see exactly how the business of spice trading worked. Marco wasn't buying spices directly, remember, the spices were still in India or the Spice Islands at this point. Instead, he was entering into contracts with Arab merchants who would obtain the spices and deliver them back to Alexandria at a specified future date for a specified price. These contracts were complex legal documents drawn up by scribes who specialized in cross-cultural trade law. According to Dr. Abraham Udovich's research on medieval Islamic commercial law, these contracts had to be enforceable under both Islamic and Christian legal systems, which required careful wording and often the involvement of religious authorities on both sides. A typical contract would specify the exact quantity and quality of spices to be delivered, the price to be paid, the delivery date, penalties for non-delivery, and the legal jurisdiction for any disputes. Marco records signing a contract on the 3rd of June, 1347, with an Arab merchant named Ibrahim al-Habashi. Ibrahim agreed to deliver 1,000 pounds of black pepper, 200 pounds of ginger, and 50 pounds of cinnamon to Alexandria by April of 1348, for a total price of 3,500 ducats. Marco paid 1,000 ducats up front as a deposit, with the remaining 2,500 ducats to be paid on delivery. But then something happened that Marco couldn't have anticipated, something that would change his life and the course of European history. In October of 1347, a Genoese merchant ship arrived in Alexandria from the Crimea. The ship brought with it rats infected with plague. Within weeks, people in Alexandria were dying. Within months, the plague was spreading across the Mediterranean world. By 1348, it would reach Europe and kill 1/3 of the population. We know this as the Black Death. Marco's account book from October 1347 to March 1348 makes for grim reading. He records the progression of the plague through Alexandria. The 20th of October heard reports that people are falling sick in the Egyptian quarter of the city. The symptoms are said to be horrible fever, swellings in the neck and groin, black spots on the skin. Those who fall sick die within days. The 28th of October, the plague has reached the Fondaco. 3 Venetian merchants died yesterday. We are all terrified. I have not left the Fondaco in a week. The 5th of November, half the Fondaco is sick. The dead are being carried out wrapped in sheets and buried in mass graves outside the city. I can hear the death carts passing all night and the moaning of the sick. I pray constantly that God will spare me. The 18th of November, I have developed a fever. I fear this may be the end. But Marco survived. He was one of the lucky ones, according to modern medical research by Dr. Susan Scott and Dr. Christopher Duncan. Approximately 30 to 40% of people exposed to bubonic plague survived, either because they had some natural immunity or simply because they were lucky. Marco fell sick with plague, recovered after 2 weeks of agony, and found himself alive in a city that was dying around him. His entry from December 1347 is haunting. I have recovered from the plague, but I am not sure I should be grateful. The city is like a tomb. Bodies lie in the streets because there are not enough living to bury the dead. The markets are closed. The ports are empty. No ships will come here now. Those of us who survived are trapped in this dying city with no way to leave and no way to know what is happening in the rest of the world. I have had no word from Venice since the plague began. I do not know if Caterina still lives. I do not know if my parents still live. I do not know if Venice itself still stands. I am alive, but I feel dead inside. The plague burned through Alexandria for 6 months. By the time it subsided in early 1348, Perhaps half the city's population was dead. The Arab merchant Ibrahim al-Habashi was among the dead. So was the scribe who had drawn up Marco's contract. So were most of the Italian merchants in the Fondaco. Marco was one of only a handful of Venetian merchants who survived, and here is where Marco faced an agonizing decision. His contract with Ibrahim was void, Ibrahim was dead, and his heirs claimed they were not bound by his agreements. Marco's 1,000-ducat deposit was lost. Marco had no spices, no cargo, no way to fulfill his obligations to his partners back in Venice. The smart thing to do would be to cut his losses and go home. He'd be in debt, but at least he'd be alive. But Marco made a different choice. He records his reasoning in his account book. I came to Alexandria with 2,000 ducats of borrowed money and nothing to show for it. If I return to Venice now, I will be in debt for the rest of my life. My family will be ruined. Caterina, if she still lives, will be married to a debtor, and any children we have will inherit nothing but shame. I cannot bear that thought, so I have decided to risk everything on one more gamble. I will use what little money I have left to travel to India myself. I will buy spices directly, cutting out the Arab middlemen. If I succeed, I can still return to Venice with a cargo and honour my obligations. If I fail, at least I will have tried everything. This decision to travel beyond Alexandria to India was extraordinary. Very few European merchants in the 14th century made this journey. It was dangerous, expensive, and required months of additional travel through Muslim lands where Christians had no legal protection. But Marco was desperate, and desperate men take desperate measures. Marco left Alexandria in April 1348 on an Arab merchant ship bound for Aden. His account book describes a harrowing 6-week voyage. The ship is crowded with merchants, pilgrims, and refugees fleeing the plague. We are packed so tightly that there is barely room to lie down at night. The food is terrible: dried fish, hard biscuits, and brackish water. Many of the passengers are sick, and I fear the plague may be among us. I sleep with my money belt tied around my waist, for I trust no one on this ship. But at least we are moving, and every day brings me closer to India, and hopefully to the spices that will save my fortune. The ship reached Aden in late May 1348. From Aden, Marco caught another ship to Calicut on the Malabar coast, arriving in July 1348. 16 months after leaving Venice. He was the first Venetian merchant most of the Indian merchants in Calicut had ever seen, and they didn't quite know what to make of him. Marco's descriptions of India are some of the most vivid parts of his account book. He is clearly fascinated and overwhelmed by everything he sees. Calicut is a city of wonders and horrors. The heat is unbearable. I am constantly soaked in sweat. The smells are overwhelming. Spices, yes, but also rotting fish, human waste, incense, and 1,000 other odours I cannot identify. The poverty is appalling. I see beggars in the streets with terrible deformities, children who are nothing but skin and bones, but I also see wealth beyond imagining. The Hindu merchants here wear jewels that would make a Venetian nobleman weep with envy. Their houses are palaces. The Raja's court is more magnificent than anything in Europe, but what amazes me most is the trade. Every day ships arrive from Arabia, Persia, China, Java, and islands whose names I have never heard. They unload carpets, silk, porcelain, ivory, pearls, and 1,000 other goods, and they load pepper, ginger, cinnamon, and other spices. The amount of trade that passes through this one port in a single month is greater than all the trade of Venice in a year. I am beginning to understand that Europe, for all our pride and our civilization, is a backwater compared to the great trading networks of the East. In Calicut, Marco spent 3 months negotiating purchases of pepper, ginger, and cinnamon. He records paying 1,800 ducats for 2,000 pounds of pepper, 400 pounds of ginger, and 100 pounds of cinnamon. According to his calculations, if he could get this cargo back to Venice and sell it at current market prices, he would gross approximately 8,000 ducats, enough to pay back his debts, pay his partners, and still have a substantial profit left over. But getting the cargo back to Venice proved to be the hardest part of the journey. Marco's account book for the return journey is a catalogue of disasters and narrow escapes. The ship he booked passage on from Calicut to Aden was delayed for 2 months, waiting for favourable winds. When it finally departed in November 1348, it was hit by a storm in the Arabian Sea and nearly sank, Marco records. I thought we would all die. The waves were taller than buildings. Water poured into the hold, and we had to bail constantly to keep the ship afloat. My cargo was soaked with seawater, and I fear some of the spices may be ruined. But we survived, and that is all that matters. The ship limped into Aden in December 1348, badly damaged. Marco spent 2 months in Aden arranging repairs and trying to dry out his cargo. Then he had to find transport to Alexandria, which proved difficult because the plague had disrupted normal trade routes. He finally caught a ship in February 1349, but it was captured by pirates in the Red Sea. This is where Marco's story becomes truly dramatic. The pirates, Red Sea pirates, were a constant menace to merchant shipping, took the ship to a hidden cove and began looting the cargo. Marco and the other merchants were held for ransom. Marco records, the pirate captain is a man named Rashid, thin as a skeleton and with eyes that show no mercy. He has demanded 500 ducats for my freedom and is holding my cargo hostage. I have tried to negotiate, but he will not budge. I am a prisoner, and I may never see Venice again. Marco was held by the pirates for 6 weeks. During that time, he managed to strike a deal with Rashid. Instead of paying a ransom in gold, Marco offered Rashid half his cargo of spices. Rashid, who was more interested in goods he could actually use and sell than in abstract promises of gold that might never materialize. Marco walked away with half his cargo and his freedom. Marco finally reached Alexandria in May 1349, 2 years and 2 months after leaving Venice. He had survived plague, storms, and pirates. He had lost half his cargo, but he still had 1,000 pounds of pepper, 200 pounds of ginger, and 50 pounds of cinnamon. If he could get this cargo back to Venice, he might still salvage something from this disaster of a voyage. But when Marco reached Alexandria, he learned devastating news. The plague had reached Venice in the fall of 1348. 1/3 of Venice's population was dead. Among the dead were both of Marco's business partners, his father and his wife Caterina. She had died in November 1348, 7 months pregnant with his child. By the time Marco learned of her death, she had been in the ground for 6 months. Marco's account book entry from May 22, 1349 is one of the saddest things I've ever read. I have lost everything. My wife is dead. My child is dead. My father is dead. My business partners are dead. I risked everything to make my fortune, and in doing so, I lost the only things that truly mattered. I have spices worth perhaps 4,000 ducats. I have honor. I can still pay back my debts. But what does any of it matter when the people I loved are gone? I curse the day I decided to become a spice merchant. I curse my ambition and my greed. I would give every ducat I have, every spice in my cargo, for one more day with Caterina, but the dead do not return, and all my wealth cannot buy back what I have lost. Marco did make it back to Venice, arriving in August 1349. He sold his spices for 4,200 ducats, paid back his debts, and paid his late partner's shares to their heirs. After all expenses, he cleared about 800 ducats in profit, roughly $152,000 in today's money. It was a respectable sum, enough to live comfortably for several years. But it was nowhere near the fortune he had dreamed of, and it had cost him more than 2 years of his life and the woman he loved. Marco never married again. He never organized another spice voyage. He lived quietly in Venice for another 32 years, dying in 1381 at age 62. His will, preserved in the Venetian archives, left his modest estate to a nephew and made provisions for masses to be said for the souls of Katerina and their unborn child. His account book was found among his possessions after his death, and eventually ended up in the state archives where it sits today, a testament to one man's ambition, courage, loss, and regret. What really gets to me about Marco's story is that it could have turned out so differently. If the plague hadn't struck, if Ibrahim had lived and honoured his contract, if Marco had simply taken his spices and gone straight home instead of risking the return journey. So many small decisions and random chances that shaped the outcome of his life. Marco did everything right. He was brave, resourceful, honest, and determined, and it wasn't enough. The world broke him anyway. But here is what I want you to understand. Marco's story, tragic as it is, wasn't unusual. The medieval spice trade was full of stories like his merchants who risked everything, lost loved ones, endured years of hardship, and came home to find that the price of their ambition was higher than they ever imagined. For every merchant who returned wealthy and successful, there were 2 or 3 who returned broken, or who never returned at all. Tonight, as you lie there in comfort and safety, I want you to think about Marco Bellini. Think about him leaving Venice in March 1347, full of hopes and dreams, kissing his wife goodbye and promising to return wealthy. Think about him surviving the plague, crossing the Indian Ocean, facing pirates and somehow making it back to Venice, only to learn that everyone he loved was dead. Think about him living the rest of his life with the knowledge that his ambition had cost him everything that mattered. And then think about the black pepper in your kitchen, because Marco's story, and thousands of stories like his, are the reason that pepper made it from India to Europe. Every spice in your kitchen represents someone's risk, someone's sacrifice, someone's life spent travelling to the ends of the earth. We take these spices for granted now, but for medieval people, spices were soaked in tears and blood. Marco Bellini was just one merchant, but he represents thousands of men who made the same gamble, who bet their lives and their futures on the spice trade. Some won, most lost, and all of them, winners and losers alike, shaped the modern world in ways they could never have imagined. The spice trade wasn't just about commerce, it was about human ambition, human courage, and human tragedy. And tonight we're going to meet more of these men, hear their stories, and understand what drove them to risk everything for a handful of exotic seeds and dried bark from the far side of the world. Chapter 4. 5 Lives Shaped by Spices. Now I want to introduce you to 4 more merchants whose stories reveal different aspects of the spice trade, because Marco Bellini's tragic story is just one perspective on this extraordinary world. Let me tell you about Giovanni Contarini, the merchant who succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, about Ibrahim Alfasi, the Arab middleman who moved spices between East and West, about Krishna Nair, the Indian pepper merchant who supplied both Arabs and Europeans, about Jacques de Leon, the French merchant who tried and failed to break into the spice trade, and about Fatima bint Ahmed, one of the rare women involved in the spice trade, whose story reveals a side of this world that is usually hidden from history. Let me start with Giovanni Contarini, because his story is the dream that kept men like Marco Bellini gambling everything on spices. Giovanni was born in Venice in 1315, the son of a middling merchant family, comfortable but not wealthy. Like Marco, Giovanni was a younger son with no inheritance coming to him, and like Marco, Giovanni decided to make his fortune in the spice trade. But unlike Marco, Giovanni got lucky, extraordinarily, impossibly lucky. Giovanni's first spice voyage, organised in 1340 when he was 25 years old, was a spectacular success. His timing was perfect. He bought spices in Alexandria just before a series of wars in the Levant disrupted supply routes and drove prices sky. When Giovanni returned to Venice in 1342, spice prices had tripled. A cargo he had bought for 3,000 ducats sold for 12,000 ducats. His 25% travelling merchant share came to 2,250 ducats after expenses. roughly $427,000 in today's money, from a single voyage. Giovanni immediately reinvested his profits in a second voyage, this one to India. According to the account books that Giovanni's descendants donated to the Venetian state archives in the 18th century, this second voyage was even more profitable than the first. Giovanni used his profits from the first voyage to finance a larger investment in the second. This time he brought back pepper, ginger, cinnamon, and most valuably, a small quantity of nutmeg and cloves that he had managed to obtain through connections in Calicut. When he returned to Venice in 1345, his share of the profits came to 5,800 ducats, over $1.1 million in today's money. By age 30, Giovanni was one of the wealthiest merchants in Venice. He bought a palazzo on the Grand Canal, married into the Venetian nobility, and was elected to the Venetian Senate. He continued organizing spice voyages, but now as a sedentary partner, investing capital while other men took the risks of travel. According to historian Dr. Frederick Lane's analysis of Venetian merchant dynasties, the Contarini spice fortune grew to approximately 50,000 ducats by 1360, roughly $9.5 million in today's money, making them one of the 20 wealthiest families in Venice. Giovanni's sons and grandsons continued in the spice trade, and the Contarini family remained prominent in Venice for centuries. The Palazzo Contarini dal Zaffo, built with spice money in the 15th century, still stands on the Grand Canal today. Giovanni himself lived to age 68, dying peacefully in 1383, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and wealth beyond anything his father could have imagined. This is the success story that kept the spice trade going. Men looked at Giovanni Contarini, or at families like the Contarini, and thought, that could be me. I could take one or two successful voyages and set my family up for generations. The fact that Giovanni's success was partly due to timing, and luck didn't matter. What mattered was that it was possible. A commoner could become wealthy, could marry into nobility, could found a dynasty that would last for centuries. All you had to do was be brave enough, smart enough, and lucky enough. But luck is fickle, and for every Giovanni Contarini, there were a dozen men like Jacques de Leon. Let me tell you Jacques' story, because it is the other side of the spice trade, the story of failure, loss, and broken dreams. Jacques was born in Lyon, France in 1325, the son of a cloth merchant. Lyon in the 14th century was a major trading centre, strategically located on the trade routes between Italy and northern Europe. Jacques grew up hearing stories about the Italian spice merchants who passed through Lyon, about their wealth and their adventures. And like so many young men, Jacques dreamed of making his own fortune in the spice trade. The problem was that Jacques wasn't Venetian or Genoese, or from any of the Italian states that dominated the Mediterranean spice trade. French merchants were at a disadvantage. They didn't have the established trade networks, the political connections, or the financial institutions that Italian merchants could rely on. But Jacques was determined to try anyway. In 1350, at age 25, Jacques used his inheritance from his father to organize a trading expedition to the Levant. According to the account of Pierre de Lusignan, a chronicler from Lyon, Jacques invested 2,000 gold civincus, roughly $380,000 in today's money, in a cargo of woolen cloth, wine and metalwork that he planned to trade for spices in Acre, a port city in the Levant that was one of the last Crusader outposts in the Holy Land. Jacques made it to Acre safely and succeeded in trading his cargo for a modest amount of pepper and ginger. So far, so good. But then disaster struck. Acre, which had been in Christian hands since the Crusades, was under constant threat from the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. In 1351, while Jacques was still in Acre, the Mamluks launched an attack on the city. The siege lasted 3 months. Jacques, trapped inside the city, watched his spice cargo slowly dwindle as he was forced to sell it at ruinous prices to buy food for survival. When Acre finally fell to the Mamluks in August 1351, Jacques was captured and held for ransom. According to Pierre de Lusignan's account, Jacques spent 8 months in captivity before his family managed to raise the 515Q ransom, roughly $95,000 in today's money. By the time Jacques was ransomed and returned to Lyon in 1352, he had lost everything. His cargo, his investment, his inheritance, and 2 years of his life. Jacques tried to recover. He borrowed money to organize a second trading expedition, this time to Alexandria. But his luck didn't improve. The ship carrying his cargo was caught in a storm and sank off the coast of Crete. Jacques survived, but his cargo was lost, and now he was deeply in debt. He spent the next 20 years trying to pay back his creditors, working as a factor for other merchants, never making enough to dig himself out of debt. Jacques de Lyon died in poverty in 1375, at age 50. His death is recorded in the parish register of Saint Nizier Church in Lyon. Jacques de Lyon, merchant, died this day, leaving debts of 800 fiscus and no estate. May God have mercy on his soul. His widow and children were left destitute. His grandson would later write that the family name had been ruined by Jacques' ambition, and it took 3 generations before the de Lyon family recovered their social standing. What breaks my heart about Jacques' story is that he did everything Marco and Giovanni did. He was brave, determined, and willing to risk everything. But unlike Giovanni, he didn't get lucky. Unlike Marco, he didn't even manage to bring home a modest profit. Jacques failed completely and utterly, and his failure destroyed not just his own life, but his family's prospects for generations. And here is what really haunts me. Jacques' story was probably more typical than Giovanni's. For every merchant who struck it rich, there were dozens who lost everything. But we remember the success stories and forget the failures. We see the palazzos on the Grand Canal, built with spice money, and we forget all the families ruined by the spice trade, all the men who died in foreign lands or returned home broken and penniless. Now, let me tell you about the people on the other end of the spice trade, the Arab and Indian merchants who actually transported spices from the source to the Mediterranean, because the European perspective is only part of the story. The spice trade couldn't have functioned without the complex networks of Muslim and Hindu merchants who connected the Spice Islands to the Muslim world and then to Europe. Ibrahim al-Fassi was an Arab merchant from Fez in Morocco, but he made his fortune in the spice trade operating between Alexandria and Aden. According to Ibn Khaldun, the great Arab historian who knew Ibrahim personally and wrote about him in his Muqaddimah, Ibrahim was born in 1310 into a family of scholars. He was educated in Islamic law and theology, but he was drawn to commerce rather than scholarship. Ibrahim began his trading career in his 20s, working as a factor for established merchants in the Alexandria, Aden trade. This was the critical link in the spice chain. Aden was where spices from India and the Spice Islands entered the Arab trading system, and Alexandria was where they were sold to European merchants. Merchants who controlled this link could make enormous profits because they could buy spices at near-source prices in Aden and sell them at huge markups in Alexandria. But breaking into this trade wasn't easy. According to Dr. S.D. Goitein's massive study of medieval Mediterranean trade based on documents from the Cairo Geniza, the Alexandria, Aden trade was controlled by a relatively small number of merchant families who jealously guarded their connections and networks. New merchants faced suspicion and often found themselves shut out of the most profitable deals. Ibrahim spent years building relationships and proving his reliability. He made the voyage between Alexandria and Aden dozens of times, each time handling small cargoes for established merchants, learning the ins and outs of the trade, making contacts. According to Ibn Khaldun, Ibrahim's breakthrough came in 1340, when he saved a valuable cargo during a pirate attack, personally fighting off the pirates and getting the cargo safely to port. This act of courage and commitment earned him the trust of the major merchants, and he was finally accepted as a full member of the trading network. Over the next 20 years, Ibrahim became one of the most successful spice merchants operating between Egypt and Arabia. Ibn Khaldun writes that Ibrahim's wealth was estimated at over 100,000 dinars, roughly $19 million in today's money, by 1360. But Ibrahim's wealth came at a cost. The Alexandria-Aden voyage was dangerous, and Ibrahim lost several cargoes to pirates and storms over the years. He was captured by pirates twice and had to be ransomed both times. He nearly died of fever during a voyage in 1352. What is fascinating about Ibrahim's story, according to Ibn Khaldun, is that Ibrahim explicitly saw his work as serving Islam. Ibrahim was a devout Muslim who prayed 5 times a day and made the pilgrimage to Mecca 3 times during his life. He endowed several mosques and madrasas in Fez and Alexandria, using his spice wealth to support Islamic scholarship and education. In Ibrahim's view, he wasn't just making money, he was facilitating trade between Muslim lands, helping to enrich the Islamic world, and then using that wealth to serve God. This is an aspect of the spice trade that European sources rarely acknowledge. For Muslim merchants, the spice trade wasn't just business. It was part of a larger Islamic commercial network that spanned from Spain to Indonesia, a network that predated and exceeded European trade networks. Muslim merchants had been trading spices for centuries before Europeans got involved, and they saw European merchants, like Marco Bellini, as Johnny Come. Latelys trying to muscle in on established trade routes. Ibrahim died in 1368 during a voyage from Aden to Alexandria. His ship was caught in a storm and sank, and Ibrahim was among those lost. Ibn Khaldun writes, Ibrahim al-Fasi was a man of great courage and great faith. He sought wealth, yes, but he sought it to serve God. He gave generously to the poor, supported scholars and students, and lived modestly despite his great wealth. His death is a loss to all who knew him. May Allah grant him paradise. Now, let me tell you about Krishna Nair, because his story reveals yet another perspective on the spice trade, that of the Indian merchants who were the original source of most spices that Europeans craved. Krishna was born in Calicut on the Malabar coast of India in 1320, into a family of pepper merchants. His family had been in the pepper trade for generations. They owned pepper plantations in the Western Ghats Mountains, and had established trading relationships with Arab and Chinese merchants long before Europeans appeared on the scene. According to the palm leaf manuscripts preserved in the Kerala State Archives, analysed by Dr. Pius Malakandathil, Krishnan inherited his family's pepper business in 1345, when his father died. At that time, the family owned 3 pepper plantations totaling about 200 acres, producing approximately 30,000 pounds of pepper annually. This pepper was sold to Arab merchants, who shipped it to Aden, and from there to Alexandria, and ultimately to Europe. Krishnan's business operated on a seasonal rhythm determined by the monsoons. Pepper was harvested in the winter months, November through January, when the peppercorns were fully ripe. The pepper was then dried, sorted by quality, and stored in warehouses in Calicut, waiting for the Arab merchant ships that arrived with the summer monsoon winds in June and July. These Arab merchants would buy the pepper, load it onto their ships, and sail back to Arabia with the winter monsoon winds in December and January. This system had operated for centuries, and it was highly profitable for everyone involved. According to Dr. Malakandathil's analysis of price records, pepper that cost Krishnan about 2 rupees per pound to produce would sell to Arab merchants for 5 rupees per pound, a 150% markup. The Arab merchants would then sell it in Aden for 10 rupees per pound, and European merchants would eventually sell it in Europe for 40 rupees per pound equivalent. Everyone made money, and everyone was happy. But in the 1340s, something new happened. European merchants started showing up in Calicut. Not many, just a handful of Venetians and Genoese, but they were offering to buy pepper directly, cutting out some of the Arab middlemen. This created a dilemma for merchants like Krishnan. The Arab merchants were his traditional customers with whom his family had done business for generations. But the European merchants were offering higher prices. According to the palm leaf manuscripts, Krishnan decided to sell to both Arabs and Europeans, carefully balancing his relationships to avoid offending either side. In 1348, he sold 20,000 pounds of pepper to Arab merchants at 5 rupees per pound, and 10,000 pounds to a Venetian merchant, quite possibly Marco Bellini, though the manuscripts don't record the Venetian's name, at 6 rupees per pound. This balancing act was delicate. The Arab merchants didn't like Europeans muscling in on their trade, and they put pressure on Indian suppliers not to sell directly to Europeans. But the higher prices Europeans were willing to pay were hard to resist. Krishnan, like many Indian merchants, found himself caught between competing interests, trying to maintain old relationships while taking advantage of new opportunities. Krishnan's manuscripts also reveal something else important: the Indian perspective on Europeans. Krishnan writes that the European merchants were strange men with pale skin who dress in heavy wool despite the heat, who eat no rice, who know nothing of proper behaviour, and who are constantly sick with fevers and flux. They are brave to come so far from their homes, and they pay good prices. But they are difficult to deal with because they understand nothing of our customs and become angry when we try to explain. This is a perspective we rarely see in European sources, Europeans through Indian eyes. To Krishnan, European merchants weren't impressive adventurers or sophisticated traders. They were peculiar foreigners who didn't understand local customs, who got sick constantly, and who had to be patiently educated in how business was properly conducted. The European idea that they were bringing civilization to the East would have struck Krishnan as hilarious. From his perspective, Indians were the civilized ones, and Europeans were barbarians who somehow had a lot of money. Krishnan Nair lived to age 69, dying in 1389. According to his family's records, he expanded his pepper plantations to over 500 acres and established trading relationships with merchants from Arabia, China, and Europe. His grandsons continued the family business, and the Nair family remained prominent in the Calicut pepper trade into the 16th century, until the Portuguese conquest of Calicut destroyed the traditional trading networks. Finally, let me tell you about Fatima bint Ahmed, because her story reveals a side of the spice trade that is usually invisible in historical records. Fatima was a Muslim woman from Cairo who became involved in the spice trade, not as a merchant, but as a financier and moneylender. According to documents from the Cairo Geniza analysed by Dr. S.D. Goitein, Fatima was born in Cairo in 1315, the daughter of a successful textile merchant. When her father died in 1335, Fatima inherited his business. This was possible under Islamic law, which gave women inheritance rights that European women of the same period didn't have. Fatima didn't travel or handle physical goods herself. That would have been unusual for a woman in 14th century Cairo, though not impossible. Instead, Fatima financed other merchants' voyages, lending them money at interest in exchange for a share of the profits. According to the Geniza documents, Fatima was involved in financing at least 15 different spice trading voyages between 1340 and 1365, investing a total of approximately 50,000 dinars, about $9.5 million in today's money. This was sophisticated financial work. Fatima had to evaluate the creditworthiness of merchants, assess the risks of different voyages, structure contracts that protected her interests while giving merchants incentive to succeed, and manage a portfolio of investments to spread risk. According to Dr. Goitein, Fatima employed several male agents who handled the day-to-day business dealings, but Fatima herself made all the major decisions about which ventures to finance. Fatima's correspondence, preserved in the Geniza, reveals a sharp business mind. In one letter to a merchant seeking financing for a voyage to Aden, Fatima writes, "You propose that I finance 5,000 dinars for your voyage in exchange for 30% of the profits. But your last 3 voyages have returned a profit of only 10%, 15%, and 20% respectively. At those rates, my return would not justify the risk I am taking. I propose instead that I finance 5,000 dinars in exchange for 40% of the profits, or alternatively, I will finance 3,000 dinars in exchange for 30% of the profits. Choose which arrangement you prefer. That is not the letter of someone who is passively lending money. That is a sophisticated financier negotiating terms based on careful risk analysis. Fatima was, in effect, running a medieval investment bank, and she was apparently very good at it. According to the Janaiza documents, Fatima's wealth grew substantially over her career, and she died in 1372, leaving an estate worth approximately 80,000 dinars, about $15 million in today's money. What strikes me about Fatima's story is how different her experience of the spice trade was from Marco's or Ibrahim's. She never saw a spice island, never risked her life on a dangerous voyage, never left Cairo, but she was absolutely essential to the functioning of the spice trade. Without financiers like Fatima willing to put up capital, most merchants couldn't have afforded to organize their voyages. Fatima's money paid for ships, cargoes, and crews. Her risk-taking made the entire system possible. And yet, Fatima's story is almost unknown. She doesn't appear in any European sources. Most histories of the spice trade don't mention female financiers at all. We know about Fatima only because of the Cairo Janaiza, a collection of Jewish documents preserved in a Cairo synagogue that happened to include some of Fatima's business correspondence. How many other Fatimas were there, financing the spice trade from behind the scenes, whose stories are lost because no one thought to record them? These 5 people, Marco, Giovanni, Jacques, Ibrahim, Krishnan, and Fatima, represent the diverse reality of the medieval spice trade. Success and failure, Christian, Muslim, and Hindu, European, Arab, and Indian, men and women, travellers and stay at homes. They all participated in the same system, all contributed to bringing spices from the Spice Islands to European tables, but their experiences and perspectives were vastly different. What unites all their stories is risk. Every single one of these people gambled something precious: money, time, relationships, lives on the spice trade. Some won, some lost, but all of them were driven by the same basic human motivations: the desire for wealth, for status, for security, for a better life for themselves and their families. The spice trade wasn't abstract economics or grand historical forces. It was individual people making individual choices, each one hoping that their gamble would pay off. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, I want you to think about these 5 lives. Think about Marco losing his wife while he was away chasing spices. Think about Giovanni building a palazzo with his spice fortune. Think about Jacques dying in poverty because his gambles failed. Think about Ibrahim seeing his trade as serving God. Think about Krishnan trying to balance old relationships with new opportunities. Think about Fatima running a medieval investment bank from her home in Cairo. All these different lives, all connected by the same thread, the global trade in exotic flavors that shaped the medieval world. And then think about the spices in your kitchen. Every one of those spices has stories behind it. Human stories of risk and reward, success and failure, courage and tragedy. The spice trade wasn't just about moving goods from one place to another. It was about human ambition, human courage, and the extraordinary lengths people will go to in pursuit of wealth and status. We're going to explore more of these stories tonight. But first, let's take a breath and let these 5 lives sink in, rest for a moment. And when you are ready, we'll continue our journey into the fascinating, dangerous world of the medieval spice merchants. Chapter 5. The Perils of the Journey: Pirates, Storms, and Disease. Now, as you are settling deeper into comfort tonight, I want to take you on the actual physical journey that spices made from the Spice Islands to European tables. because understanding the dangers, the logistics, and the sheer difficulty of moving goods across 10,000 miles in the medieval world helps us understand why spices were so valuable and why merchants were willing to risk everything to trade in them. Let me start with the most dramatic danger: piracy. Medieval piracy was rampant across every major trade route, and pirates were sophisticated, organized, and often backed by rival states. According to Dr. Peter Earle's comprehensive study of medieval Mediterranean piracy at the University of London, there were at least 50 organized pirate bands operating in the Mediterranean alone in the 14th century, with fleets ranging from 3 to 20 ships each. These weren't small-time criminals. They were essentially private navies that controlled specific stretches of coastline and sea routes. The most notorious pirate havens in the Mediterranean were the Barbary coast of North Africa, modern-day Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, and the islands of the Aegean Sea. Barbary pirates, operating from bases in Tunis, Algiers, and Tripoli, preyed on Christian merchant ships travelling between Italy and the Levant. According to records compiled by Dr. Robert Davis at Ohio State University, Barbary pirates captured an average of 120 merchant ships per year during the 14th century, taking cargoes worth millions of ducats and capturing thousands of Christian sailors and passengers who were sold into slavery. Let me tell you about a specific pirate attack documented in the account book of a Genoese merchant named Luca Grimaldi. In 1352, Luca was travelling from Genoa to Alexandria on a merchant galley called the Santa Maria. The galley was carrying a mixed cargo: Genoese wool, German metalwork, and Luca's personal investment of 3,000 ducats in coral and glassware that he planned to trade for spices in Alexandria. The galley had a crew of 180 men, 30 sailors to handle the ship, and 150 oarsmen, who could also fight if needed. On the morning of the 15th of June, 1352, 2 days out from Genoa, lookouts spotted sails on the horizon. As the ships got closer, the worst fears were confirmed. Pirates. 3 ships, flying no flags, approaching fast. The captain of the Santa Maria tried to outrun them, but the pirate ships were lighter and faster. By noon, they had caught up. What happened next, according to Luca's account, was a nightmare. The pirate ships drew alongside the Santa Maria, and over 200 pirates swarmed aboard, armed with swords, axes, and crossbows. The crew of the Santa Maria fought back, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. The battle lasted less than an hour. By the time it was over, 45 of the Santa Maria's crew were dead, another 60 were wounded, and the rest had surrendered. The pirates had lost only 12 men. The pirates took everything. They stripped the ship of its cargo, its sails, its anchors, even the personal possessions of the crew and passengers. Luca lost his 3,000 ducats of trade goods, his personal clothing, his account books, everything. Then the pirates sorted the survivors. The wounded and the elderly were thrown overboard. Pirates had no use for people who couldn't work. The healthy men, including Luca, were chained together in the hold of one of the pirate ships. Luca spent the next 8 months as a slave, rowing one of the pirate ships. He describes the experience in harrowing detail. We were chained to the oars, 6 men to each oar, and forced to row for hours at a time. We were fed once a day, a handful of mouldy biscuits and a cup of foul water. Men died constantly. From exhaustion, from disease, from the beatings administered by the pirate overseers. When a man died, his body was simply thrown overboard, and a new slave was chained in his place. I watched friends die beside me, watched their bodies tumble into the sea, and I wondered every day if tomorrow would be my turn. Luca was eventually ransomed by his family. They paid 800 ducats to the Barbary pirates to get him back, and he returned to Genoa in February 1353, 8 months after his capture. But he was a broken man. He had lost his investment, his health, and many of his friends. His account book records, "I will never sail the Mediterranean again. I would rather die poor in Genoa than risk another voyage. The sea is cursed, and merchants who sail it are gambling with their lives." And Luca's story wasn't unusual. According to Dr. Davis's research, approximately 15,000 to 20,000 Christians were being held in slavery in North Africa at any given time during the 14th century, most of them captured from merchant ships. The ransom business was so profitable that specialized intermediaries, often Jewish merchants who could operate in both Christian and Muslim worlds, made their livings negotiating ransoms and transferring money between families in Europe and pirates in North Africa. But piracy in the Mediterranean, dangerous as it was actually less deadly than piracy in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. These waters were controlled by Arab and Malay pirates, who were even more ruthless than their Mediterranean counterparts. According to the account of Ibn Battuta, who travelled the Red Sea route in 1330, the Red Sea is infested with pirates who show no mercy. They kill any who resist, enslave those who surrender, and take every cargo. A ship that sails the Red Sea without a strong escort is gambling with death. The Indian Ocean was no better. Malay pirates, operating from bases in the Strait of Malacca and the Indonesian archipelago, preyed on the spice ships sailing between the Spice Islands and India. These pirates were particularly dangerous because they knew the local waters intimately. They could hide in mangrove swamps and small inlets, then dart out to attack passing ships. According to Dr. Leonard Andia's research at the University of Hawaii, Malay pirate fleets sometimes numbered 50 or more ships, making them powerful enough to challenge even well-armed merchant convoys. One particularly notorious pirate was a Malay chief named Pate Alam, who controlled a fleet of 40 ships and terrorized the Strait of Malacca in the 1340s. According to Chinese merchant accounts translated by Dr. Wade Jeff of the National University of Singapore, Pate Alam demanded tribute from every merchant ship passing through the strait, typically 10% of the cargo value. Ships that refused to pay were attacked and their crews killed. Pate Alam became so powerful that he effectively controlled all trade through the strait, and merchants had to factor his tax into their cost calculations. Think about that. Pirates were so powerful in some regions that they functioned essentially as an unofficial government, taxing trade and enforcing their will. This wasn't lawless chaos. This was a parallel system of power and control that coexisted with official governments. Merchants like Marco Bellini or Ibrahim Al-Fassi had to navigate both official customs duties and unofficial pirate tribute, and refusing to pay either could be fatal. Now, let's talk about storms, because natural disasters killed even more merchants and sailors than pirates did. The medieval period experienced significant climate instability. Historians call it the medieval warm period, followed by the beginning of the Little Ice Age, and this instability meant unpredictable weather patterns and fierce storms. According to Dr. Brian Fagan's research on medieval climate, documented in his book The Little Ice Age, the period from 1300 to 1400 saw some of the most violent storms in recorded history, with hurricane-force winds, massive flooding, and sudden temperature drops that could freeze ships solid in previously navigable waters. Mediterranean storms, while less frequent than in northern waters, could be absolutely devastating when they struck. Galleys, which sat low in the water and had relatively little freeboard, were particularly vulnerable. A really big wave could swamp a galley, flooding the hold and sinking the ship in minutes. According to shipping records analysed by Dr. John Pryor, the average medieval galley had a lifespan of only about 10 years before it was lost to storms, piracy, or other disasters. That is an astonishingly high attrition rate. Let me tell you about the Great Storm of November 1343, one of the most devastating maritime disasters of the medieval period. According to chronicles from multiple Italian cities, compiled by Dr. David Abulafia of Cambridge University, a massive storm struck the Mediterranean on the 25th of November 1343, with winds so strong they tore the roofs off buildings in coastal city. The storm lasted for 3 days, and when it finally subsided, over 80 merchant ships had been sunk or driven onto rocks. The death toll was estimated at between 3,000 and 4,000 sailors and merchants. The value of lost cargo was incalculable. Several major Venetian and Genoese merchant houses went bankrupt because their entire trading fleet had been wiped out in a single storm. One survivor, a Venetian merchant named Paolo Morosini, wrote an account of the storm that is preserved in the Venetian State Archives. "I have sailed the Mediterranean for 20 years and I have never seen anything like this storm. The waves were taller than church towers. The wind shrieked like demons. Our galley was tossed about like a toy. We had 200 men aboard, and we all believed we would die. Men were praying, weeping, calling for their mothers. I tied myself to the mast, certain that at least my body might wash ashore where my family could give me a Christian burial. But by the grace of God, our ship survived. When the storm finally ended and we could take stock, we found that 40 of our crew had been washed overboard. Our cargo holds were flooded, and half our cargo of pepper and cinnamon was ruined by seawater. We limped into port having lost everything. I sold what remained of the cargo for barely enough to pay my debts. I curse the day I became a spice merchant. The Indian Ocean was even more dangerous than the Mediterranean. Monsoon storms in the Indian Ocean could be catastrophic. The monsoon winds that made Indian Ocean trade possible, blowing from southwest in summer and northeast in winter, could sometimes turn into violent cyclones that sank entire fleets. According to Arab Maritime Chronicles, studied by Dr. George Awarani, major monsoon storms occurred roughly every 5 to 7 years, and each one could sink dozens of ships. The monsoon season also created a cruel timing dilemma for merchants. The winds that allowed ships to sail from Arabia to India blew strongly only for a few months each year, roughly June through September. If you missed that window, you had to wait a full year for the winds to change again. This meant that merchants were constantly pressured to sail even when conditions looked marginal, because missing the monsoon could mean losing an entire year's business. Many ships that sailed late in the monsoon season, trying to catch the last favourable winds, sailed straight into storms and were lost. One particularly tragic example comes from the account of a Persian merchant named Hassan al-Basri, whose ship was caught in a monsoon storm in September 1356. Hassan's account, preserved in a Persian merchant manual, describes the disaster. "We sailed from Hormuz bound for Calicut on the 15th of September, which the captain said was the last safe sailing day of the monsoon season. On the 3rd day of our voyage, the sky turned black and the wind began to howl. The storm struck with a fury I cannot describe. Waves crashed over our deck, washing away men, cargo, everything not tied down. The ship's mast snapped like a twig. We were driven before the wind for 2 days, with no control over our course, certain that every moment would be our last. When the storm finally ended, we found ourselves far off course, the ship badly damaged, and 80 of our 150 passengers and crew lost. We drifted for 5 days before another ship found us and towed us to port. Of our cargo of spices worth 10,000 dinars, less than 2,000 dinars worth remained. The captain, crushed by guilt over his decision to sail so late in the season, threw himself into the sea that night. I reached Hormuz 6 months after I had left, having lost everything. I will never sail during monsoon season again." Now let's talk about disease, because disease was the biggest killer of all. In an era without antibiotics, without proper sanitation, without understanding of germ theory, even minor illnesses could turn deadly. And the conditions aboard merchant ships, hundreds of men packed into cramped, dark, poorly ventilated spaces, with limited fresh water and food, no way to properly wash or maintain hygiene, created perfect conditions for disease to spread. The most common killer was what medieval sources called ship fever, probably typhus, spread by lice that thrived in the crowded, filthy conditions aboard ship. According to medical historian Dr. K. David Patterson at the University of North Carolina, typhus killed approximately 10 to 15% of sailors on long voyages. Symptoms included high fever, severe headaches, and a distinctive rash. Once typhus broke out on a ship, it spread rapidly through the crew, killing dozens before the voyage ended. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water and food, was almost as common. Medieval ships carried water in wooden barrels, where it quickly became stagnant and infested with bacteria. Add in the heat of the tropics, and the water on ships sailing to India or the Spice Islands was often undrinkable after a few weeks. Sailors had little choice but to drink it anyway, leading to outbreaks of severe dysentery that could kill through dehydration. Dr. Patterson estimates that dysentery killed another 5 to 10% of sailors on typical voyages. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was a constant problem on long voyages. Medieval sailors' diet consisted primarily of dried biscuits, salted meat, and cheese, no fresh fruits or vegetables. After a few months at sea, sailors would begin developing scurvy symptoms, weakness, bleeding gums, loose teeth, joint pain, and eventually death. According to Dr. Kenneth Carpenter's research on the history of scurvy, approximately 30 to 50% of crew members on voyages lasting more than 3 months would develop scurvy symptoms, and 5 to 10% would die of it. And then there was malaria. Ports in the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, India, and Southeast Asia were all endemic for malaria. Mosquitoes swarmed in these tropical ports, and merchants and sailors who spent time there almost inevitably contracted malaria. Without quinine or any effective treatment, malaria was often fatal, and those who survived the acute phase often suffered recurring fevers for the rest of their lives. Dr. William McNeill, in his landmark book Plagues and Peoples, estimated that malaria killed more European merchants and sailors in Asian ports than all other causes combined. Let me tell you about a specific voyage to illustrate the horrific death toll from disease. In 1345, a Venetian merchant galley called the Marco Polo left Venice bound for Alexandria with a crew of 200 men. The galley reached Alexandria safely, then continued down the Red Sea to Aden. From Aden, it crossed to Calicut in India. The entire outbound voyage took 8 months, and by the time the ship reached Calicut, 45 men had died, 15 from typhus, 18 from dysentery, 8 from scurvy, and 4 from various accidents and violent incidents. In Calicut, the ship spent 3 months loading spices and waiting for the monsoon winds to shift. During this time, another 30 men died, mostly from malaria contracted in the port. The return voyage was even worse. A typhus outbreak killed 50 men. Scurvy, which had been kept somewhat under control on the outbound voyage, became severe on the return voyage, killing another 20 men. By the time the Marco Polo limped back into Venice in August 1347, 2 years and 2 months after leaving, only 55 of the original 200 crew members were still alive. A death rate of 72.5%. Think about that. Nearly 3 out of every 4 men who left Venice on that voyage never came home, and this wasn't considered exceptionally disastrous. It was at the high end of normal, according to Dr. Frederick Lane's analysis of Venetian shipping records. The average death rate on voyages to India was about 30 to 40%. That means that when a merchant galley left Venice for India, the crew and passengers could realistically expect that 1/3 of them wouldn't survive the journey. Can you imagine signing up for a job knowing you had a 1 in 3 chance of dying? That is what being a sailor on a spice trading voyage meant. And yet men did it year after year, because the wages were good sailors on spice voyages earned 2 to 3 times what they could earn on Mediterranean coastal trading. And because many had no other options, the men who rowed galleys were often desperately poor, with families to feed and debts to pay. The promise of good wages, even at the risk of death, was better than the certainty of poverty at home. For merchants like Marco Bellini or Ibrahim Al-Fassi, the danger was somewhat less. They could afford better accommodations on the ship, better food, better medical care. But they still faced all the same risks: pirates, storms, disease. And they had the added stress of knowing that their entire fortune was at risk. that a single disaster could wipe out years of work and planning. Tonight, I want you to think about what it meant to be a medieval merchant embarking on a spice voyage. You are kissing your wife and children goodbye, knowing there is a real possibility you'll never see them again. You are boarding a ship that is cramped, dark, filthy, and dangerous. You are going to spend months or years away from home, traveling through hostile territories, speaking languages you don't know, dealing with people who may see you as an enemy or a target. You are going to watch men die from disease, from violence, from accidents. You are going to experience fear, loneliness, homesickness, and despair. And you are doing all of this for spices, for pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, for flavors that will end up on the tables of wealthy Europeans who have no idea what those spices cost in human suffering. Every time a medieval European sprinkled pepper on their food, someone had risked their life to bring that pepper to them. Every time they added cinnamon to their wine, someone had sailed across deadly seas to obtain that cinnamon. The spices we take for granted today were literally paid for in blood. But despite all these dangers, pirates, storms, disease merchants kept making the voyage. The potential rewards were simply too great to resist. A successful spice voyage could transform your life and your family's future. And so men kept gambling, kept risking, kept dying, all for the chance at wealth and status that spices represented. Now, as you lie there tonight, breathing easily, safe and comfortable, I want you to take a moment to appreciate that safety. The medieval spice merchants couldn't take a single day for granted. Every morning they woke up alive was a small victory. Every port they reached safely was cause for celebration. They lived with constant danger, constant uncertainty, and the knowledge that they might die far from home, unmourned and forgotten. We're going to continue exploring this world tonight. We're going to see how the spices that these merchants risked everything to obtain changed European society. We're going to look at the dark side of the spice trade, the slavery, the exploitation, the environmental destruction, and we're going to trace the legacy of the medieval spice trade into our modern world. But first, let's pause and let the weight of these dangers sink in. The spice trade wasn't romantic or adventurous. It was brutal, deadly, and filled with suffering, and yet it shaped the modern world in ways we're still discovering. Chapter 6. How Spices Transformed European Society. Tonight, I want to tell you about something fascinating. How a handful of exotic flavors changed European culture, cuisine, medicine, and even politics in profound ways. Because the medieval spice trade wasn't just about moving commodities from east to west. It was about transforming European society itself, creating new class divisions, new tastes, new medical practices, and new ways of thinking about the world. Let's start with cuisine, because that is the most obvious impact before spices became widely available in Europe. Roughly before the 11th century, European food was relatively bland by modern standards. According to food historian Dr. Terence Scully at Wilfrid Laurier University, the typical European diet in the early medieval period consisted of bread, porridge, seasonal vegetables, and meat when available. Flavouring came primarily from local herbs, parsley, sage, thyme, mint, and from fermented products like cheese and wine. Food was nutritious but not particularly exciting. The arrival of spices changed everything. By the 14th century, wealthy Europeans were consuming food that was almost unrecognizable compared to earlier cuisine. Dr. Scully's analysis of medieval cookbooks reveals that high-status dishes typically included at least 5 to 7 different spices, and some recipes called for a dozen or more. A single dish might include pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, mace, cardamom, and saffron, all in quantities that would seem excessive by modern standards. Let me give you a specific example from the most famous medieval cookbook, Le Viandier by Guillaume Tyrol, also known as Tyrlevant, who was the head cook for King Charles V of France. One of Taillevant's recipes is for civet de sanglier, wild boar stew. The recipe, written around 1375, calls for wild boar meat, onions, wine, vinegar, and then black pepper, long pepper, grains of paradise, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and saffron. That is 7 different spices in a single dish. According to Dr. Scully's calculations, the spices in this recipe would have cost more than the meat itself. Why were medieval Europeans so obsessed with heavily spiced food? The traditional explanation is that spices were used to mask the taste of spoiled meat. But as I mentioned earlier, that is largely a myth. Medieval Europeans weren't eating rotten food. They had effective preservation techniques, and spoiled meat was considered inedible, just as it is today. According to Dr. Paul Friedman at Yale University, the real reason Europeans loved spices was more complex and more interesting. First, spices were associated with paradise. Medieval Europeans believed that spices came from the Garden of Eden or regions near it. The Bible mentions spices multiple times, always in contexts of luxury, holiness, and divine favor. The Queen of Sheba brought spices as gifts to King Solomon. The Magi brought frankincense and myrrh to baby Jesus. In Revelation, the New Jerusalem is described as having streets paved with golden gates adorned with pearls, and the air is filled with the scent of spices. To eat heavily spiced food was, in a sense, to taste paradise, to experience a little bit of the divine here on earth. Second, medieval medical theory taught that spices were necessary for good health. The dominant medical theory of the time was humouralism, based on the ancient Greek physician Galen's teachings. According to this theory, the body contained 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and health depended on keeping these humours in balance. Different foods had different temperaments: hot, cold, wet, or dry, and eating the right combination of foods would balance your humours. Spices were generally considered hot and dry, which made them ideal for counterbalancing the cold and wet nature of many European foods, especially fish and vegetables. According to Dr. Luc Demaitre's research on medieval medicine at the University of Virginia, medieval physicians prescribed specific dishes for specific conditions: ginger for digestive problems, cinnamon for fever, pepper for melancholy, cloves for toothache, saffron for virtually everything. It was considered a near universal medicine. Wealthy medieval families kept detailed household accounts that show how much they spent on spices, both for cooking and for medicine. The accounts of the household of the Earl of Derby in England for the year 1390, analysed by Dr. C.M. Woolger at the University of Southampton, show that the family spent £48 on spices, roughly $46,000 in today's money. In a single year, this was about 15% of the family's total food budget, and this was just for one wealthy family. Multiply that across all of Europe's nobility and wealthy merchant class, and you begin to see the enormous economic impact of the spice trade. But the impact went beyond cuisine and medicine. Spices became central to social rituals and displays of status. Medieval banquets were not just meals. They were theatrical performances designed to demonstrate the host's wealth, power, and sophistication, and spices played a starring role in these performances. Let me describe a typical aristocratic banquet in 14th century France based on contemporary accounts compiled by Dr. Barbara Hunnewalt at Ohio State University. The banquet would begin with entremeats entertainment courses between the main dishes, which might include singers, acrobats, or even live animals. Then came the first course, perhaps a dozen different dishes, all heavily spiced. Roasted peacock with ginger and cinnamon, pike with a sauce of pepper and cloves, venison with a crust of crushed pepper and mustard. Each dish was more elaborate and more heavily spiced than the last. Between courses, servants would bring around spiced wine mixed with honey and flavoured with cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and sometimes even pepper. According to recipes preserved in medieval household manuals, Spiced wine typically used about 1 ounce of mixed spices per gallon of wine. At a major banquet serving 100 guests, you might go through 20 gallons of spiced wine, which means 1¼ pounds of expensive spices just for the wine. The final course was often the most spectacular, a subtlety, an elaborate decorative dish shaped like a castle, a ship, or some mythical scene, covered in gold leaf and surrounded by clouds of aromatic spices. One famous subtlety, served at a banquet for the Duke of Burgundy in 1454, was a model of a castle 3 feet tall, with towers made of marzipan and battlements dusted with powdered cinnamon and gold leaf. Inside the castle was a roasted swan, and when servants opened the castle, clouds of saffron-scented steam poured out, creating a dramatic visual effect that impressed all the guests. Think about the expense of such a banquet. The spices alone might cost 100 to 200 ducats, $19,000 to $38,000 in today's money, for a single meal. This wasn't about nutrition or even really about taste. This was about power, about demonstrating that you were so wealthy you could literally set money on fire to impress your guests. It was conspicuous consumption taken to an extreme that would be shocking even today. And it wasn't just the nobility engaging in this spice arms race. Wealthy merchants competed to throw lavish banquets that rivaled those of the aristocracy. Guild banquets held to celebrate religious feast days or the installation of new guild officers featured multiple courses of heavily spiced dishes. Even relatively modest urban households tried to serve spiced dishes on special occasions like weddings and christenings. The pressure to display status through spice consumption pervaded all levels of medieval society that could afford it. This created a massive market for spices, which in turn drove the expansion of trade routes, the development of new financial instruments, and the accumulation of enormous wealth by merchants who could successfully supply this demand. The profits from the spice trade financed the construction of churches, palaces, and public buildings. It funded art, literature, and scholarship. The Renaissance itself was partially bankrolled by spice money. Wealthy Italian merchants used their spice fortunes to patronize artists like Michelangelo, Raphael, and Leonardo da Vinci. But the spice trade also exacerbated social inequalities. Spices became a marker of class division in a way that no food had been before. The wealthy ate heavily spiced food, the poor ate bland food. According to tax records and household accounts analyzed by economic historian Dr. Jean Devereis at the University of California, Berkeley, a wealthy urban family in 14th century Europe might spend 10 to 15% of their income on spices, while a poor family spent essentially nothing on spices. They couldn't afford them. This created a visible, tasteable difference between the classes. Medieval moralists and preachers often railed against excessive spice consumption as a sign of gluttony and pride. One Franciscan friar, Berthold of Regensburg, preaching in the mid-13th century, declared, "You rich people eat your meat with so many spices that the meat itself is almost invisible beneath the pepper and cinnamon and ginger. You do this not for health but for pride, to show that you can afford what the poor cannot, and God sees this pride, and he is angry." But these sermons had little effect. The wealthy continued to consume spices in enormous quantities because the social pressure to display wealth through spice consumption was simply too strong. The spice trade also had profound political impacts. Venice's dominance of the Mediterranean spice trade made it one of the wealthiest and most powerful city-states in Europe. According to Dr. Frederick Lane's Economic History of Venice, at the height of Venetian power in the 15th century, spice profits accounted for approximately 30 to 40% of the Venetian state's revenue. That is an astonishing percentage. It means that nearly half of Venice's power and influence came from control of the spice trade. This wealth allowed Venice to maintain a powerful navy, build spectacular architecture like St. Mark's Basilica, and exercise diplomatic influence. far beyond what a city of 150,000 people should reasonably have had. When Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, Venice negotiated trading privileges with the Ottomans by leveraging its wealth and its importance as a market for spices. The Venetian diplomatic service, funded largely by spice profits, was the most sophisticated in Europe, with ambassadors gathering intelligence and negotiating deals across the known world. Other Italian cities, Genoa, Pisa, Florence, competed fiercely with Venice for shares of the spice trade, and this competition sometimes erupted into open warfare. The wars between Venice and Genoa in the 13th and 14th centuries were fundamentally about control of trade routes and markets, and spices were at the heart of these conflicts. According to Dr. Stephen Epstein's research at the University of Kansas, the Venetian-Genoese wars resulted in over 30,000 deaths and the expenditure of millions of ducats, all to control the flow of pepper, cinnamon, and cloves from east to west. The spice trade also drove technological innovation. The need to preserve spices during long voyages led to improvements in barrel making and cargo storage. The need to navigate precisely across the Indian Ocean drove advances in cartography and navigation instruments. The need to finance spice voyages led to the development of sophisticated financial instruments, bills of exchange, insurance contracts, joint stock companies, that would later form the basis of modern capitalism. According to economic historian Dr. Janet Abu-Lughod, in her book Before European Hegemony, the medieval spice trade created what was essentially the first global economy, connecting Europe, the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, and indirectly China into a single trading system. Goods, money, people, ideas, and diseases all flowed along the spice routes, transforming every society they touched. But perhaps the most profound impact of the spice trade was on European mentality and worldview. The existence of valuable spices that could only be obtained from distant eastern lands created a powerful incentive for Europeans to learn about and eventually travel to these lands. Every medieval European who ate pepper or cinnamon was consuming evidence that there was a wider world out there, a world full of marvels and riches waiting to be discovered. This knowledge created a restless desire for exploration and discovery that would eventually transform the world. Christopher Columbus wasn't primarily looking for new lands when he sailed west in 1492. He was looking for a western route to the Spice Islands. Vasco da Gama's voyage around Africa to India in 1497–98 was explicitly an attempt to break the Arab and Venetian monopoly on the spice trade. Ferdinand Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe in 1519–1522 was financed by Spanish merchants hoping to reach the Spice Islands by sailing west. The age of exploration was in many ways the age of spice seeking. Tonight, as you lie there, I want you to think about how profoundly spices shaped the medieval world and continue to shape our world today. The global economy, the age of exploration, the Renaissance, modern capitalism, all of these have roots in the medieval spice trade. Every time you use pepper or cinnamon, you are participating in a tradition that is over 1,000 years old, a tradition that literally changed the world. We're going to continue exploring this story tonight. We're going to look at the dark side of the spice trade, the slavery, the violence, the environmental destruction, and we're going to see how the legacy of the medieval spice merchants lives on in ways you might never have imagined. But for now, rest a moment. Let these ideas settle in your mind. And when you are ready, we'll continue our journey into this fascinating, terrible, transformative world of spices. Chapter 7, The Dark Side: Slavery, Violence, and Exploitation. Now I need to tell you about the parts of the spice trade that don't appear in romantic histories, the parts that make this story difficult and uncomfortable, because while spices brought wealth to European merchants and flavor to European tables, they brought suffering to the people who actually grew, harvested, and transported them. Tonight, as you lie there in comfort, I want you to hear the stories of the people whose labor and lives made the spice trade possible. and whose suffering was the hidden cost of Europe's luxury. Let's start in the Spice Islands themselves. The Moluccas, those tiny islands in what is now eastern Indonesia that were the sole source of cloves and nutmeg. According to the accounts of Chinese and Arab traders who visited these islands in the 14th century, compiled by historian Dr. Anthony Reid at the Australian National University, the indigenous people of the Moluccas lived in small kingdoms ruled by local rajas. These were relatively egalitarian societies, where most people were free farmers who owned their own land and grew spices alongside food crops. But the spice trade changed everything. As European demand for cloves and nutmeg exploded in the 13th and 14th centuries, the value of these spices skyrocketed. Local rajas realized that controlling spice production could make them enormously wealthy, and they began to reorganize their societies around spice cultivation. According to Dr. Reid's research, by the late 14th century, large portions of the Moluccas had been converted from food production to spice monoculture, entire islands devoted solely to growing cloves or nutmeg. This transformation had devastating consequences for local populations. Food had to be imported from other islands, making the Moluccas dependent on outside trade for basic survival. When trade was disrupted by wars, by piracy, by bad weather, people starved. Dr. Reid documents multiple famines in the Moluccas during the 14th and 15th centuries. Famines that killed thousands of people on islands that should have been able to feed themselves easily. But the transformation went beyond agriculture. The rajas who controlled spice production needed labour, lots of it. Clove and nutmeg trees required constant care, and at harvest time, thousands of workers were needed to pick, sort, and dry the spices. Where did this labour come from? Increasingly, it came from slaves. According to Dr. James Warren's research on Southeast Asian slavery at Murdoch University, the spice trade created an enormous demand for slave labour in the Moluccas. Local rajas conducted raids on neighbouring islands, capturing people and forcing them to work on spice plantations. Arab and Malay slave traders brought slaves from mainland Southeast Asia, from the Philippines, even from as far away as Africa. By the 15th century, according to European accounts, slaves made up between 30 and 50% of the population in some parts of the Moluccas. Let me tell you about the conditions these slaves endured, based on the account of a Javanese merchant named Prapanka, who visited the Moluccas in 1365 and wrote about what he saw. Prapanka describes slave workers being forced to climb tall clove trees to harvest the flower buds, dangerous work that often resulted in falls and serious injuries. Slaves who failed to meet daily harvest quotas were beaten. Slaves who tried to escape were hunted down and, if caught, often killed as an example to others. Female slaves were routinely sexually exploited by overseers and owners. Prapanka writes, "I have travelled throughout Java and the islands, and I have seen slavery in many places, but the slavery I witnessed in the Clove Islands was particularly cruel. These people are worked from dawn to dusk, given barely enough food to survive, and treated as less than human. I saw children as young as 7 or 8 being forced to climb trees to harvest cloves. I saw pregnant women being beaten for working too slowly. I saw old men and women too weak to work, simply left to die. And all of this suffering, all of this cruelty, so that wealthy foreigners can flavour their food with exotic spices." The slave trade that supplied the Moluccas was part of a larger system of slavery that permeated the entire spice trading network. Arab merchants who transported spices from India to the Middle East routinely used slave labour to row their ships and carry their cargoes. According to Dr. Bernard Lewis's research on slavery in the Islamic world, the medieval Arab slave trade moved approximately 10,000 to 15,000 people per year from sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia to the Middle East, and many of these slaves ended up working in occupations related to the spice trade. European merchants, while they didn't directly own slaves in the spice-producing regions, were absolutely complicit in this system. They knew that the spices they bought had been produced and transported by slave labour. They knew that their demand for cheap spices created incentives for Rajahs and Arab traders to capture and exploit more slaves. But they didn't care, or if they cared less about distant slaves than about their own profits. Marco Bellini, whose tragic story I told you earlier, certainly knew about slavery in the spice trade. His account book contains several passages where he mentions seeing slaves in Indian ports and in Alexandria, but he never expresses any moral qualms about the institution. For Marco, as for most medieval Europeans, slavery was simply part of how the world worked. The idea that there was something fundamentally wrong with buying products made by slave labor wouldn't become widespread in Europe for another 500 years. But slavery wasn't the only dark aspect of the spice trade. Violence was endemic at every level. Let me tell you about the spice wars. Conflicts between rival kingdoms and sultanates fighting for control of spice, producing regions and trade routes. These weren't minor skirmishes. These were full-scale wars that killed thousands of people and devastated entire regions. One of the most destructive spice wars occurred in the Moluccas in the 1350s, when the sultanates of Ternate and Tidore, two small islands that were major clove producers, went to war over control of neighbouring islands and their spice production. According to Portuguese accounts from the early 16th century, which preserved oral traditions about this earlier war, the conflict lasted for over 20 years and resulted in the deaths of thousands of people. Entire villages were destroyed. Clove groves were burned, populations were enslaved or displaced, and this wasn't an isolated incident. Dr. Leonard Andia's research on Moluccan history documents dozens of wars and conflicts in the region during the medieval period, most of them related in some way to control of the spice trade. The wealth that spices generated created constant incentives for violence, as every ruler wanted to control as much of the trade as possible. The violence extended to the sea routes as well. I've already told you about piracy, but piracy was just one form of maritime violence. Naval warfare between competing maritime powers, Venice and Genoa, various Arab sultanates, Malay kingdoms, regularly disrupted trade and killed merchants and sailors. According to Dr. John Pryor's research on medieval naval warfare, major naval battles in the Mediterranean during the 13th and 14th centuries resulted in tens of thousands of deaths, and control of spice trade routes was often a key objective in these conflicts. One particularly brutal example occurred in 1298, when Venetian and Genoese fleets fought the Battle of Curzola off the Dalmatian coast. The battle was ostensibly about control of Dalmatian ports, but both sides understood that the real prize was control of spice trade routes between the Adriatic and the Levant. According to contemporary chronicles, the battle involved nearly 200 ships and over 30,000 men. When it ended, 85 ships had been sunk or captured, and approximately 10,000 men were dead. Among the prisoners taken by the Genoese was a Venetian merchant named Marco Polo, who would spend a year in a Genoese prison, where he dictated his famous account of his travels to the east. Think about that. 10,000 men died in a single battle, essentially over spices. The wealth and power that came from controlling the spice trade was so great that rulers were willing to send thousands of men to their deaths to secure or defend that control. Every peppercorn, every cinnamon stick, every clove that reached European tables was stained with blood. The environmental impact of the spice trade was also severe, though medieval people barely noticed or cared about it. The conversion of diverse ecosystems to spice monoculture destroyed habitats and reduced biodiversity. According to modern ecological research by Dr. John Dransfield at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew, the Moluccas originally had some of the most biodiverse forests in the world, with thousands of plant species found nowhere else. But as more and more land was converted to clove and nutmeg plantations, this biodiversity was lost. The forests of the Western Ghats in India, where much of the world's pepper was grown, suffered similar degradation. Traditional pepper cultivation involved growing pepper vines on existing forest trees in a relatively sustainable way. But as demand increased, more forest was cleared to create dedicated pepper plantations, destroying wildlife habitat and causing soil erosion. Dr. K.T. Akaya's research on Indian agricultural history estimates that between the 12th and 15th centuries, approximately 500,000 acres of forest in the Western Ghats were cleared for pepper cultivation, an area roughly the size of Rhode Island. This deforestation had cascading effects on local populations. Indigenous peoples who had depended on forest resources for food, medicine, and materials were displaced or forced to become laborers on the plantations that had replaced their forests. Wild animal populations that local people had traditionally hunted declined or disappeared. Water sources were disrupted. The ecological and human costs were enormous, though they went largely unrecorded in medieval sources. Now, let me tell you about exploitation within the spice supply chain itself, because even free workers, not slaves, were often treated terribly. The spice trade operated on a system of debt bondage that kept workers trapped in poverty despite the enormous wealth flowing through their hands. Let me give you a specific example from the pepper trade in Malabar. According to palm leaf manuscripts analysed by Dr. Pius Malakandathil, pepper plantation workers in 14th century Malabar were typically paid not in cash but in advances of food and necessities, which they were expected to repay through their labour during harvest season. The plantation owners kept careful records of these advances, and workers who couldn't repay their debts through their harvest labour were forced to continue working to pay off what they owed. The system was designed to keep workers perpetually in debt. The prices plantation owners charged for food and necessities were inflated. The prices they paid for harvested pepper were deflated. Workers found that no matter how hard they worked, they could never quite pay off their debts. And the debts were inheritable. When a worker died, their children inherited the debt and the obligation to work it off. This created a cycle of debt bondage that could trap families for generations. One manuscript tells the story of a pepper picker named Kunan, who worked on a plantation near Calicut. Kunan had inherited a debt of 15 rupees from his father. Over 20 years of work, he managed to reduce this debt to 10 rupees. But in that same period, he had incurred new debts for food, medicine when his wife was sick, and a loan to pay for his daughter's wedding. By the time Kunan died, his total debt had grown to 30 rupees, which his sons inherited. The manuscript writer notes, "Thus the wheel of debt turns generation after generation, and the workers remain poor while the owners grow rich from their labour." This exploitation extended to every level of the spice trade. Sailors were routinely cheated of their wages. Porters and dock workers were paid starvation wages. Small-scale merchants were squeezed between powerful suppliers and powerful buyers, barely making enough to survive. For every merchant like Giovanni Contarini who made a fortune from spices, there were hundreds of workers whose labour made those fortunes possible, and who saw almost none of the wealth they created. And here is what really gets to me. The people who suffered most from the spice trade, the slaves, the exploited workers, the dispossessed indigenous peoples, never tasted the spices they produced. The cloves and nutmeg harvested by slaves in the Moluccas went to flavour the food of wealthy Europeans who had never heard of the Moluccas and couldn't have found them on a map. The pepper picked by debt-bonded workers in Malabar ended up on the tables of Venetian merchants who had no idea who had actually grown it. The people who produced spices ate bland food, while the people who consumed spices had no connection to or understanding of the suffering that went into their production. This disconnect between production and consumption, between suffering and luxury, is something we should find deeply disturbing. It is also something that still exists in our modern world, as we'll explore later tonight. But for now, I want you to sit with the discomfort of this knowledge. Every medieval banquet wealthy Europeans gorged on heavily spiced food was built on a foundation of slavery, violence, exploitation, and environmental destruction. The spices that symbolized luxury and status in Europe symbolized suffering and death in the places where they were produced. Medieval Europeans were largely ignorant of these costs, or if they knew about them, they didn't care enough to change their behavior. The suffering of distant, dark-skinned people didn't register as important to them. This wasn't unusual for the time. Most people throughout history have been more concerned with their own immediate needs and desires than with the distant consequences of their consumption. But that doesn't make it any less tragic. Now, I want to be clear, I am not trying to make you feel guilty about using spices. The point of telling you these dark stories isn't to ruin your enjoyment of pepper and cinnamon. The point is to understand the full reality of the spice trade, to see it as it really was rather than as a romantic tale of adventure and exploration. The spice trade was a complex system that created wealth for some and suffering for many, that drove innovation and exploration while also driving exploitation and violence. Tonight, we're going to continue exploring this complexity. We're going to see how the legacy of the medieval spice trade shaped the age of exploration, colonialism, and our modern global economy. We're going to draw connections between medieval spice merchants and modern global supply chains, and you might be surprised or disturbed by how similar they are. But first, take a breath. Let yourself feel whatever you are feeling about what I've just told you. The spice trade wasn't simple, and our feelings about it shouldn't be simple either. Chapter 8: The Age of Exploration. When Europe went looking for spices. Now, as you are settling deeper into the night, I want to tell you about how the medieval spice trade directly led to one of the most transformative periods in world history, the Age of Exploration. Because those Spanish and Portuguese explorers you learned about in school, Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Ferdinand Magellan, they weren't primarily looking for new continents or scientific knowledge. They were looking for spices. They were trying to break the Arab and Venetian monopoly on the spice trade and find direct routes to the Spice Islands. Let's start with the Portuguese, because they were the first Europeans to successfully find a sea route to India that bypassed the Mediterranean and the Middle East entirely, and the man who made this possible was Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal, though the Navigator is actually a misleading title. Henry never went on any of the voyages he sponsored. He stayed in Portugal, organising expeditions and collecting information. According to the Chronicle of Gomes, Inês de Zurara, who was Henry's official chronicler, Henry's primary motivation was to find a sea route to the source of spices and other valuable Asian goods. Henry understood that Venetian and Genoese merchants were buying spices in Alexandria and the Levant at enormous markups. He reasoned that if Portuguese ships could sail around Africa and reach India directly, they could buy spices at much lower prices and make enormous profits. Starting in the 1420s, Henry sponsored a series of expeditions down the west coast of Africa. Each expedition pushed a little further south than the last, gradually mapping the African coastline and learning about winds and currents. It was slow, painstaking work. According to Dr. Malin Newitt's research on Portuguese exploration at King's College London, Henry spent over 40 years and an enormous amount of Portuguese royal revenue on these expeditions, and he died in 1460 without seeing a Portuguese ship reach India. But Henry's successors continued his work. In 1488, Bartholomew Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, proving that it was possible to sail from the Atlantic Ocean into the Indian Ocean. 9 years later, in 1497, Vasco da Gama led an expedition that sailed all the way from Portugal to Calicut in India, completing the sea route that Henry had dreamed of. Vasco da Gama's voyage is worth examining in detail because it reveals both the extraordinary courage and seamanship of the Portuguese explorers, and the violence that accompanied European expansion into the Indian Ocean. Da Gama left Lisbon in July 1497 with 4 ships and about 170 men. The voyage down the African coast and around the Cape took 4 months, with the fleet enduring terrible storms and losing many men to scurvy. By the time they reached the east coast of Africa, In January 1498, about 30 men had died. On the East African coast, Da Gama encountered the Swahili trading cities Mombasa, Malindi, that were part of the Indian Ocean trading network that connected Africa, Arabia, and India. These cities were wealthy, sophisticated, and predominantly Muslim. According to Da Gama's own account, preserved in Portuguese archives and analysed by Dr. Sanjay Subramaniam at UCLA, Da Gama viewed these Muslim merchants as competitors and enemies. When the Portuguese ships entered Mombasa harbour, they were greeted with hostility by local merchants, who correctly saw the Portuguese as potential threats to their trading networks. Da Gama responded with violence. When his demands for supplies and information were not met to his satisfaction, he bombarded Mombasa with his ship's cannons, killing an unknown number of people. He took hostages from local boats, torturing them to extract information about sailing routes to India. This pattern of violence would characterize Portuguese expansion throughout the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese fleet reached Calicut in May 1498, 10 months after leaving Portugal. For the first time, European ships had reached India by sea without using the Mediterranean route and without dealing with Arab middlemen. Da Gama met with the Zamarin ruler of Calicut and tried to establish trading relations, but the meeting didn't go well. According to contemporary accounts, the Zamarin was unimpressed by the Portuguese gifts. Some hats, coral, oil, which seemed paltry compared to the rich gifts that Arab merchants typically brought. And when Da Gama tried to buy spices, he found that Arab and Indian merchants in Calicut had no interest in selling to the Portuguese at competitive prices. Despite these setbacks, Da Gama managed to obtain some pepper and cinnamon, only about £3,000 total, a small cargo compared to what he had hoped for. He left Calicut in August 1498 and began the long voyage home. The return trip was even more deadly than the outbound voyage. Contrary winds meant the crossing from India back to Africa took 3 months instead of 3 weeks. Scurvy ravaged the crews. By the time the ships reached the African coast, so many men had died that Da Gama had to scuttle one of his ships because there weren't enough healthy sailors to crew it. Da Gama reached Lisbon in September 1499, 2 years and 2 months after he had left. Of the 170 men who had started the voyage, only 54 returned, a death rate of 68%, even worse than typical spice voyages using the traditional Mediterranean route. Da Gama's brother Paulo, who had commanded one of the ships, died just before reaching Portugal. But despite the horrific human cost, the voyage was considered a triumph because it proved that the sea route to India was possible. More importantly, even with his tiny cargo of spices, Da Gama made a profit. According to historian Dr. De Oliveira Marques, the 3,000 pounds of pepper and cinnamon that Da Gama brought back sold for approximately 60 times what it had cost to purchase in India. Even after accounting for the enormous expenses of the voyage, there was still a substantial profit, and this was with a tiny cargo on an exploratory voyage. A proper trading voyage, with ships designed to carry cargo, could potentially make enormous profits. The Portuguese crown immediately organised follow-up expeditions. In 1500, Pedro Cifadel Vaz Cabral led a fleet of 13 ships to India, and this time the Portuguese came armed for conflict. When Arab merchants in Calicut tried to prevent the Portuguese from trading, Cabral bombarded the city, killing an estimated 600 people and destroying dozens of Arab merchant ships. He then sailed to Cochin, a rival port city, and established a Portuguese trading post there, bypassing Calicut entirely. Over the next 2 decades, the Portuguese systematically used military force to insert themselves into the Indian Ocean spice trade. They built fortified trading posts at key locations. They attacked and destroyed Arab merchant ships, disrupting the traditional trading networks. They formed alliances with some local rulers against others, exploiting existing rivalries. According to Dr. Sanjay Subramaniam's research, between 1500 and 1520, Portuguese military actions in the Indian Ocean resulted in approximately 15,000 to 20,000 deaths. mostly Arab and Indian sailors and merchants. This was a deliberate strategy, orchestrated by Afonso de Albuquerque, who served as Portuguese governor of India from 1509 to 1515. Albuquerque understood that the Portuguese couldn't compete with established Arab and Indian merchants on equal terms. The Portuguese didn't know the languages, the customs, the markets. But what the Portuguese had was superior naval technology and a willingness to use violence. Their ships had cannons, which gave them an advantage over traditional Indian Ocean trading vessels that were unarmed. Albuquerque's strategy was to control key choke points in Indian Ocean trade routes through a combination of fortified bases and naval patrols. He captured Hormuz at the entrance to the Persian Gulf in 1507. He conquered Goa on the west coast of India in 1510, making it the Portuguese Asian headquarters. He captured Malacca on the Malay Peninsula in 1511, controlling the strait through which spices from the Moluccas had to pass to reach India. According to Albuquerque's own letters to the Portuguese king, his goal was to destroy Arab trade and give Portugal a monopoly on the spice trade. And it worked, at least partially, by 1520. According to Dr. Michael Pearson's research on the Indian Ocean, Portuguese ships were carrying approximately 15 to 20% of all spices leaving India for Western markets. Not a complete monopoly, but a substantial share. Arab merchants still controlled most of the trade, but Portuguese competition had disrupted traditional patterns and reduced Arab profits. But Portuguese success came at enormous cost, and not just in terms of the violence inflicted on others. The mortality rate among Portuguese sailors and soldiers in Asia was horrific. According to research by Dr. Charles Boxer, approximately 50% of Portuguese men who sailed to Asia never returned. Many died of disease in Asian ports where malaria, dysentery, and other tropical illnesses killed thousands. Others died in shipwrecks in battles or simply disappeared. Between 1500 and 1600, an estimated 1 million Portuguese men sailed to Asia. About 500,000 never came home. Now let's talk about Christopher Columbus, because his story is directly connected to the spice trade even though he never found the spice islands he was looking for. Columbus was a Genoese sailor who had spent years trying to convince European monarchs to fund a westward voyage to Asia. His basic idea was simple: since the Earth is round, you should be able to reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean, just as you can reach it by sailing east. This would provide an alternative route to the Spice Islands that would bypass both the Portuguese route around Africa and the traditional Mediterranean route controlled by Venice. Columbus's calculations were wrong. He thought Asia was much closer to Europe than it actually is. If the Americas hadn't existed, Columbus and his crew would have died of thirst and starvation somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from any land. But Columbus was convinced he was right, and he spent years lobbying for funding. Finally, in 1492, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain agreed to fund Columbus's expedition. Why did they finally say yes after years of rejections? According to Dr. William Phillips's research at the University of Minnesota, multiple factors were involved: religious zeal, political competition with Portugal, Columbus's persuasive lobbying. But economic motivations were crucial. Spain was being left behind in the spice trade. Portugal had the African route. Venice controlled the Mediterranean. Spain had nothing. A western route to the Spice Islands, if it existed, would give Spain its own access to these valuable commodities. Columbus's contract with Ferdinand and Isabella explicitly mentions trade with Asia and the acquisition of gold, spices, and other valuable goods. Columbus himself wrote that one of his goals was to reach the lands of the Grand Khan China and establish trade in pearls, precious stones, gold, silver, spices, and other goods. The spice trade wasn't his only motivation, but it was certainly a major one. We all know what happened. Columbus sailed west and encountered Caribbean islands that he insisted until his death were part of Asia. He found no spices. The Caribbean had no pepper, cinnamon, cloves, or nutmeg. He did find some local spices that he tried to pass off as Asian spices. He brought back samples of allspice and chili peppers and claimed they were related to Asian spices. According to his account of his first voyage, analysed by Dr. Valerie Flint at the University of Hull, Columbus spent his entire time in the Caribbean looking for spices and gold, convinced that the Spice Islands must be nearby. Columbus made 4 voyages to the Caribbean, and on each one he searched for spices and insisted he was close to finding them. He never admitted that he had found a new continent rather than a route to Asia. Other explorers, realizing that Columbus had found something unexpected, began calling it the New World. But Columbus went to his grave in 1506, still believing he had reached the outskirts of Asia and that the Spice Islands were just a little further west. Columbus's mistake, finding America while looking for spices, would have enormous consequences that no one could have anticipated. The Spanish conquest of the Americas, the decimation of indigenous populations, the transatlantic slave trade, the Columbian exchange of plants, animals, and diseases. All of this flowed from Columbus's spice-seeking voyage. In a very real sense, the existence of the United States today, the fact that English, Spanish, and Portuguese are spoken across the Americas, the entire demographic and cultural landscape of the Western Hemisphere, all of it traces back to Columbus trying to find a shortcut to the Spice Islands. Finally, let me tell you about Ferdinand Magellan, whose expedition achieved what Columbus had tried to do: find a western route to the Spice Islands. Magellan was a Portuguese navigator who had served in the Portuguese Navy in Asia and had actually visited the Moluccas. He knew exactly where the Spice Islands were and how valuable they were. But Magellan had fallen out with the Portuguese king and offered his services to Spain instead. Magellan's proposal to the Spanish crown was essentially a more educated version of Columbus's plan: sail west, but this time knowing that you need to go around South America to reach the Pacific Ocean, then sail across the Pacific to the Moluccas. It would be an incredibly long and dangerous voyage, but if successful, it would give Spain its own route to the spice source, independent of both Portugal and the traditional Muslim-controlled routes. Spain funded Magellan's expedition, and in September 1519, Magellan left Spain with 5 ships and about 270 men. The voyage would take 3 years and would be one of the most remarkable feats of navigation in history. Magellan discovered the strait at the southern tip of South America, now called the Strait of Magellan, that connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. He then sailed across the Pacific, a journey that took 3 months and 20 days, during which the crew nearly starved to death. Magellan reached the Philippines in March 1521 and was killed there in a battle with local inhabitants. But his fleet continued on to the Moluccas, where they loaded their ships with cloves. According to the account of Antonio Pigafetta, one of the few survivors who later wrote about the journey, they loaded 26 tons of cloves onto the 2 remaining ships. 3 ships had been lost during the voyage. Only one ship, the Victoria, made it back to Spain, arriving in September 1522 with just 18 survivors of the original 270 men, a death rate of 93%, the highest of any major exploration voyage. But the cargo of cloves was so valuable that even this single ship's cargo was enough to cover all the expenses of the expedition and still generate a profit. According to Dr. Lawrence Bergreen's research, the 26 tons of cloves sold for approximately 10,000 ducats in Spain, roughly $1.9 million in today's money, while the entire expedition had cost about 8,000 ducats to outfit. Think about that. An expedition that killed 93% of its participants, that took 3 years, that circumnavigated the entire globe, was considered successful because it brought back enough cloves to make a profit. That tells you everything you need to know about how valuable spices were and how far Europeans were willing to go to obtain them. The age of exploration was many things. It was about religious conversion, political competition, personal ambition, scientific curiosity, but at its core, it was about spices. The Portuguese route to India, Columbus's discovery of America, Magellan's circumnavigation, All of these world-changing voyages were fundamentally motivated by Europe's insatiable desire for pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. The modern world, with its global connections and its legacy of colonialism, was shaped in profound ways by the medieval spice trade. Tonight, as you drift deeper towards sleep, I want you to think about this connection. Every time you look at a world map, you are looking at a world that was reshaped by the quest for spices. The boundaries, the languages, the demographics of continents. So much of this traces back to European explorers looking for spices. It is a strange thought, isn't it, that something as simple as wanting to flavor your food differently could lead to the transformation of the entire world. But that is exactly what happened. Human desire for luxury and status, expressed through the demand for exotic spices, ended up redrawing the map of the world and shaping the course of human history for centuries to come. Chapter 9. Echoes in the Modern World, the Spice Trade Today. Now, let's bring this story forward to tonight, to our own time, because the spice trade didn't end with the age of exploration. It transformed, evolved, and in many ways continues today in forms both familiar and surprising. As you settle deeper into your pillow tonight, I want to show you how the patterns we've been discussing, the quest for exotic goods, the exploitation of producers, the transformation of societies through trade, still echo in our modern world. First, let's talk about the sheer scale of today's global spice trade. According to market research compiled by Dr. Krishnendu Ray at New York University's Department of Nutrition and Food Studies, the global spice market in 2023 was valued at approximately $16.7 billion annually. That is billion with a billion. India is the world's largest producer, growing about 75 different varieties and producing roughly 1.6 million metric tons of spices each year. Vietnam is the world's largest exporter of black pepper, producing about 270,000 metric tons annually. Indonesia dominates the nutmeg market, producing about 75% of the world's supply. And tiny Grenada in the Caribbean, known as the Spice Isle, produces about 20% of the world's nutmeg. These aren't small numbers. We're talking about an enormous global industry that employs millions of people, from farmers in Kerala growing pepper on small hillside plots, to warehouse workers in Rotterdam processing massive shipments of cinnamon. According to estimates from the International Trade Center, approximately 3.2 million smallholder farmers worldwide depend on spice cultivation as their primary source of income. But here is what is really fascinating. Despite all our modern technology, refrigeration, fast shipping, chemical preservation, spices remain important and valuable. They're not worth their weight in gold anymore, of course. You can buy a pound of black pepper at the grocery store for maybe $8 or $10, not the equivalent of $380 that Marco Bellini paid. But spices are still a significant global commodity, still moving across oceans in massive quantities, still important enough that futures contracts for pepper, vanilla, and other spices are traded on commodity exchanges just like oil and wheat. Tonight, think about your own kitchen. How many spices do you have in your cupboard right now? 10, 20, 30 different jars and bottles. Each one of those represents a global supply chain, a connection to farmers in distant lands. That jar of cinnamon probably came from Sri Lanka or Indonesia. The cumin came from India or Syria. The vanilla, if it is real vanilla and not synthetic vanillin, came from Madagascar, which produces about 80% of the world's natural vanilla. According to Dr. Sarah Beskey's ethnographic research at Cornell University, published in her 2020 book, The Darjeeling Distinction, even common spices we take for granted represent complex global networks involving thousands of intermediaries, processors, and transporters. Let me tell you a modern story that echoes some of what we've heard tonight about the medieval trade. In 2017, Cyclone Enowo struck Madagascar, devastating the vanilla-growing regions in the northeastern part of the island. Madagascar's vanilla crop was reduced by about 30% that year. Within weeks, vanilla prices on global markets skyrocketed. The price of a kilogram of cured vanilla beans went from about $80 before the cyclone to over $600 by late 2017, a seven-fold increase. For a brief period, vanilla was more expensive per kilogram than silver. This price spike had consequences that rippled around the world. According to reporting by journalist Tim Smedley in The Guardian, based on research by Dr. Annemarie Mathis from the University of Hohenheim in Germany, vanilla farmers in Madagascar suddenly found themselves holding incredibly valuable crops. Stories emerged of vanilla theft, armed bandits raiding vanilla plantations and stealing curing beans. Farmers began guarding their crops with machetes and sometimes with firearms. Some farmers started curing their vanilla prematurely, while the beans were still green, just to get them to market before they could be stolen. This premature harvesting reduced quality, which created problems down the supply chain. At the same time, ice cream manufacturers, bakeries, and food companies worldwide faced a crisis. Vanilla is one of the most widely used flavorings in the world. It is in everything from ice cream to chocolate to soft drinks. Many companies couldn't afford to use real vanilla anymore and switched to synthetic vanillin made from petrochemicals or from lignin, a byproduct of paper manufacturing. According to industry estimates compiled by the International Vanilla Association, only about 1% of products labeled vanilla-flavored actually contain real vanilla. The rest use synthetic vanillin. By 2019, vanilla prices had fallen again as Madagascar's production recovered, and as other countries like Uganda increased their vanilla cultivation to take advantage of the high prices. Farmers who had taken out loans expecting high prices to continue found themselves unable to repay their debts. The boom and bust cycle played out just as it had countless times in the medieval spice trade. Do you see the echoes of the medieval patterns here? A valuable agricultural commodity produced in a specific region. Weather or political instability disrupt supply. Prices spike dramatically. Violence erupts over the valuable commodity. Producers get caught in boom and bust cycles. Consumers switch to alternatives when prices get too high. The specific details are different. We're talking about cyclones and synthetic flavorings rather than pirates and adulteration with juniper berries. But the fundamental patterns are remarkably similar. Tonight, as you listen to this story, I want you to consider another modern parallel. The way we talk about superfoods and exotic ingredients today echoes medieval European attitudes towards spices. In the Middle Ages, as we discussed earlier, spices were believed to have powerful medicinal properties. They were thought to balance the body's humours, prevent disease, and promote health. These beliefs were largely wrong. Spices do have some genuine medicinal compounds, but they're not the miracle cures medieval people believed them to be. Today, we do something similar with foods like berries, goji berries, turmeric, matcha green tea, and other ingredients marketed as superfoods. According to Dr. Marion Nessel's analysis at New York University, former chair of the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies, the term superfood has no scientific definition and is primarily a marketing concept. Yes, these foods contain beneficial compounds. Berries have antioxidants. Turmeric contains curcumin with anti-inflammatory properties. But they're not magical, and eating them doesn't guarantee health any more than eating medieval spices prevented plague. What is interesting is that many of these modern superfoods follow the same pattern as medieval spices. They're exotic. From Brazil, goji from China, matcha from Japan. They're relatively expensive. They're associated with elite consumption, and they're marketed with health claims that often exceed the scientific evidence. A small bottle of Ahai supplements might cost $30 or $40. Premium matcha powder can cost $50 for just a few ounces. Does this sound familiar? It is the same pattern of exotic luxury goods being valued partly for their rarity and association with distant, exotic places, and partly for their supposed health benefits. There is even a modern version of the medieval practice of adulteration. according to Dr. Christopher Elliott's research at Queen's University Belfast, published in his work with the Institute for Global Food Security. Food fraud is a massive problem in the modern spice trade. Ground spices are particularly vulnerable. Analysis has found paprika cut with brick dust, turmeric cut with lead chromate, a toxic yellow dye, saffron cut with corn, silk dyed red, oregano cut with olive leaves, and black pepper cut with papaya seeds. A 2019 study by the food testing company Genetic ID found that approximately 27% of retail spice products showed evidence of adulteration or mislabeling. That is more than 1 in 4. The study tested common spices like black pepper, paprika, and saffron from grocery stores across North America. They found undeclared fillers, incorrect species being used, like substituting a cheaper pepper for black pepper, and various forms of bulking agents added to increase weight. This is happening right now in our highly regulated modern food system, with all our modern testing technology. Spice adulteration isn't just a medieval problem, it is a current problem. The motivations are identical. Spices are valuable enough that there is profit to be made by cheating, but the adulteration is subtle enough that most consumers can't detect it. Medieval merchants cutting pepper with juniper berries. Modern suppliers cutting turmeric with lead chromate. It is the same fundamental dynamic playing out across centuries. Now let's talk about the working conditions in the modern spice trade, because this is where some of the darkest parallels to the medieval trade become visible. As you relax tonight, this part of the story might be uncomfortable, but it is important to understand. In 2020, a major investigation by the New York Times revealed serious labor abuses in the global supply chain for turmeric, one of the most widely used spices in the world. The investigation, reported by journalist Suzanne Rust and focusing on research by Dr. Divya Sharma from the Center for Research on Multinational Corporations in Amsterdam, documented the use of child labor and debt bondage in turmeric processing facilities in India. The investigation found children as young as 10 working in turmeric processing plants, performing dangerous tasks like operating machinery and handling chemical treatments. Workers described being trapped in debt bondage. They borrowed money from their employers and were then required to work to pay off the debt, but the terms were such that they could never fully repay it. They were, in effect, working in a form of modern slavery. The turmeric processed in these facilities was being sold to major spice companies and ending up in grocery stores and restaurants throughout the United States and Europe. This isn't an isolated case. According to research published by the Fair Labor Association and analysed by Dr. Genevieve Lebaron at the University of Sheffield's Sheffield Political Economy Research Institute, forced labour and child labour have been documented in the supply chains for vanilla, pepper, cardamom, and other spices. A 2021 study estimated that approximately 152 million children worldwide are engaged in child labour, and a significant percentage of these are working in agricultural sectors, including spice cultivation and processing. The parallels to what we discussed about the medieval spice trade are striking and disturbing. Remember when we talked about the clove plantations in the Moluccas where slaves made up 30 to 50% of the population, or the debt bondage systems that trapped Indian farmers? These patterns haven't disappeared. They've been modified, made less visible, hidden in complex global supply chains where consumers in wealthy countries are separated by many layers from the actual producers. But the exploitation continues. Tonight, think about this. When you buy a jar of turmeric or a bottle of vanilla extract, do you know where it came from? Do you know who grew it, who processed it, what conditions they worked under, whether they were paid fairly? For most of us, the answer is no. We don't know. The global supply chain is too long, too complex, too opaque. We're in almost the same position as a medieval European eating pepper, spiced meat. We're consuming something that travelled a long distance through many hands, and we have very little idea what happened along the way. There are efforts to address these problems, and I want to tell you about some of them before we move on. Fair trade certification programs have been established for many spices. According to Fair Trade International's annual reports, approximately 67,000 farmers in 33 countries were producing fair trade certified spices as of 2022. These certification programs set minimum prices, prohibit child labor and forced labor, require safe working conditions, and include social premiums that go toward community development projects. Fair trade certified spices cost more, maybe 20 to 30% more than conventional spices. But that price premium is supposed to ensure that farmers are paid fairly and that the spices were produced ethically. According to Dr. Laura Reynolds' research at Colorado State University's Center for Fair and Alternative Trade, fair trade certification has had measurable positive impacts in many communities, including increased incomes for farmers, improved working conditions, and investments in schools and healthcare facilities. But fair trade isn't a perfect solution. Critics point out that certification costs money, which can be prohibitive for the poorest farmers. There are also questions about whether the certification actually reaches down to the level of individual workers, or whether it primarily benefits farm owners and cooperative managers. According to research by Dr. Amy Schreck at California State University San Marcos, published in Studies of Fair Trade Supply Chains, the impact is mixed and highly dependent on local context. In some communities, fair trade has made a significant positive difference. In others, the benefits have been minimal or have primarily gone to better-off farmers who could afford certification. Another approach is direct trade, where roasters, retailers, or restaurants establish direct relationships with specific farmers or cooperatives, bypassing middlemen and ensuring better prices and transparency. According to Dr. Sarah Lyons' ethnographic research at the University of Kentucky, direct trade relationships can provide even better outcomes than fair trade in some cases because they're based on long-term relationships and because a larger share of the final price goes to the farmers. But direct trade is difficult to scale and requires significant investment of time and resources from buyers. The spice company Diaspora Company, founded in 2017 by Sana Javeri Kadri, provides an interesting modern example. Diaspora Company sources spices directly from single-origin farms in India and pays farmers an average of 6 times the commodity market rate for their spices. The company is transparent about pricing. Their website breaks down exactly how much of the retail price goes to farmers, how much to shipping and logistics, how much to the company's operations. A 50-gram jar of their turmeric costs about $9, which is expensive compared to conventional supermarket turmeric. But, according to interviews with Kadri, this price allows farmers to make a decent living while also producing high-quality organic spices using sustainable methods. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, I want you to think about what these modern stories tell us. The global spice trade hasn't ended, it has evolved. Spices are no longer as expensive relative to other goods as they were in medieval times, but they're still valuable enough to generate enormous industries and complex supply chains. The same patterns we saw in the medieval trade exploitation of producers, adulteration for profit, boom and bust cycles, the association of exotic foods with status and health. All of these patterns continue in modified forms today. But there is also something new: awareness and the possibility of change. In the medieval period, a European consumer had essentially no way to know where their spices came from or under what conditions they were produced. Today, we have the ability to investigate supply chains, to demand transparency, to choose fair trade or direct trade products, to hold companies accountable. We're not always using that ability effectively, but it exists in a way it never did before. Let me tell you one more modern story before we move to our conclusion. This one is about saffron, the world's most expensive spice. Saffron comes from the stigmas of the Crocus sativus flower, and it takes about 150 flowers to produce 1 gram of dried saffron. Each flower must be hand-picked, and the 3 red stigmas must be carefully extracted by hand. It is incredibly labor-intensive. which is why real saffron costs between $500 and $5,000 per pound, depending on quality, making it more expensive per weight than gold. About 90% of the world's saffron comes from Iran, particularly from the Khorasan region in northeastern Iran. According to Dr. Mohammad Hossein Fotohi Ghazvini's research at Ferdowsi University of Mashhad in Iran, saffron cultivation provides income for approximately 200,000 households in rural Iran. The harvest season is in autumn, typically lasting about 3 weeks in October and November. During this time, entire families work together to pick the flowers before dawn. The flowers must be harvested early in the morning while they're still closed, because once they open in the sun, the stigmas become difficult to extract. Iranian saffron farmers have faced particular challenges in recent years due to international sanctions. US sanctions on Iran have made it difficult for Iranian saffron to reach global markets through normal banking and trade channels. According to reporting by journalist Thomas Erdbrink in the New York Times, based on interviews with saffron traders, this has created a complex situation where Iranian saffron is often exported to countries like the UAE, relabeled as a product of those countries, and then sold on the global market. This circumvention of sanctions adds layers of middlemen and reduces the price that actually reaches Iranian farmers. At the same time, other countries have been trying to develop their own saffron industries to compete with Iran and to meet demand that can't be legally supplied from Iran. Afghanistan, particularly the Herat province, has been developing saffron cultivation as an alternative to opium poppy farming. According to Dr. David Mansfield's research published in Reports for the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit, saffron cultivation in Afghanistan increased from almost nothing in 2007 to about 19 metric tons by 2019, making Afghanistan the world's second largest producer after Iran. The Afghan government and international development organizations have been promoting saffron as a legal, lucrative alternative to opium, and it has been somewhat successful in providing income for rural farmers. Morocco, particularly the Talouin region in the Anti-Atlas Mountains, also produces high-quality saffron. Spain, particularly the La Mancha region, has a centuries-old saffron tradition and produces smaller quantities of very high-end saffron. And there are even saffron farmers in unlikely places, Vermont and Pennsylvania in the United States, Tasmania in Australia, New Zealand, and Kashmir in India, all have small but growing saffron industries. What I find fascinating about the modern saffron trade is how it demonstrates both the persistence of traditional agricultural knowledge and the way global politics shapes trade. Saffron is still grown using essentially the same methods that were used thousands of years ago. It still must be hand-picked at dawn. The stigmas still must be carefully extracted and dried. No one has figured out how to mechanize the process. It is one of the few major agricultural products that has largely resisted industrialization. At the same time, the saffron trade is shaped by modern forces, international sanctions, development aid policies, commodity trading, food safety regulations, and consumer demand for traceability and quality. The high value of saffron means it is particularly vulnerable to fraud. Fake saffron made from dyed corn silk, safflower, or even plastic is widely sold. According to testing done by food authenticity laboratories, including research published by Dr. Lorenzo Cuadras Rodriguez at the University of Granada in Spain, a significant percentage of saffron products on the market are either fake or adulterated with cheaper materials. Tonight, think about what this means. Here we have a spice that has been traded for thousands of years, that is still grown using traditional methods, that is still expensive and precious, that is still subject to fraud and adulteration, and that is still caught up in global politics and economics. Saffron connects us directly to the long history of the spice trade, while simultaneously being shaped by very modern concerns. It is a perfect example of how the past and present intertwine in the world of spices. Let me share one final reflection on the modern spice trade before we move to our conclusion. In 2019, researchers at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew in London, published a study in the journal Nature Plants that assessed the conservation status of spice plants. According to Dr. Tiziana Ulian and her colleagues who conducted the research, they found that many spice species are at risk due to overharvesting, habitat loss, and climate change. Wild vanilla species in Central America and the Caribbean are endangered due to habitat destruction and overharvesting. Wild populations of black pepper in India's Western Ghats are declining. Certain rare cardamom species are threatened. The study found that about 18% of the spice species they assessed were threatened with extinction, a higher rate than for plants overall. This is a new kind of concern that medieval spice traders never had to consider. They might have worried about temporarily depleting a particular grove of cinnamon or a particular clove tree, but they didn't think in terms of species extinction or ecosystem collapse. We do because we've seen it happen. We've watched species disappear, forests vanish, ecosystems degrade. The scale of human impact on the planet is now so large that even something as simple as growing spices raises conservation concerns. At the same time, there is also a growing awareness of the importance of biodiversity in spice cultivation. According to Dr. Buon Stapit, is research with Bioversity International, now part of the Alliance of Bioversity International and SIAT, traditional spice varieties maintained by farmers contain genetic diversity that could be crucial for adapting to climate change and resisting diseases. There are movements to preserve heirloom varieties of pepper, to maintain traditional cultivation practices for cardamom, to protect wild relatives of cultivated spice plants. This brings us to a profound question. Can we have a global spice trade that is both sustainable and just? Can we enjoy exotic flavors from around the world without exploiting the people who produce them or destroying the environments where they grow? These are new questions in the long history of the spice trade, but they're essential questions for tonight and for the future. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, I want you to hold these modern echoes in your mind alongside the medieval stories I've been telling you. The spice trade hasn't ended, it has transformed. The patterns of desire for exotic goods, the challenges of long-distance trade, the risks of exploitation and fraud, all of these continue. But we also have new tools, better information, awareness of global interconnection, movements for fair trade and sustainability, scientific understanding of impacts. Chapter 10. The Legacy of the Spice Trade. What it taught us about ourselves. As we approach the end of tonight's journey through the world of medieval spice merchants, I want to step back and consider what this whole story means. What does the history of the spice trade tell us about human nature, about economics, about the forces that shape our world? As you settle deeper into your pillow tonight, let's reflect on the larger lessons hidden in these tales of merchants, sailors, farmers, and consumers separated by centuries, but connected by their desires. The first and perhaps most fundamental lesson is this: luxury goods have a power far beyond their practical utility. Pepper doesn't provide essential nutrition that you can't get from other foods. Cinnamon doesn't cure diseases. Cloves and nutmeg don't prevent plague. And yet people were willing to risk their lives, spend fortunes, travel to the ends of the earth, and build vast commercial empires to obtain these substances. Why? According to Dr. John Kay, author of The Spice Route, A History, the answer lies in something deeply human, the desire for distinction, for status, for participation in luxury. Spices allowed medieval Europeans to demonstrate their wealth and sophistication. They transformed ordinary meals into exotic experiences. They connected consumers to distant, mysterious places. They offered the promise, however illusory, of health and vitality. In short, spices met psychological and social needs that went far beyond nutrition. Tonight, think about how this pattern continues in our own lives. We don't spend fortunes on pepper anymore, but we do spend significant money on other luxury goods that serve similar psychological functions. designer clothing that costs 10 times more than functionally equivalent generic clothing, premium smartphones that offer marginally better features at vastly higher prices, exotic foods like truffle oil or Wagyu beef, craft cocktails made with rare ingredients. These goods aren't primarily about function. They're about distinction, status, experience, and identity. The economist Thorstein Veblen, writing in 1899, coined the term conspicuous consumption to describe spending on luxury goods primarily to display wealth and status, rather than for practical utility. According to Veblen's theory, analysed and extended by countless economists, since humans are social creatures who care deeply about their status relative to others in their social group, we use consumption, what we buy, what we wear, what we eat, as a way of signalling our position in social hierarchies. The medieval spice trade was in many ways an elaborate system of conspicuous consumption. The merchant who could afford to serve heavily spiced meat at a banquet was demonstrating his wealth. The lady who wore perfumes made with exotic spices was signalling her elite status. The king who could afford to import massive quantities of spices was displaying his power. The specific substance, pepper versus cinnamon versus nutmeg, mattered less than what it signified: connection to global trade networks, wealth, sophistication, and power. This brings us to a second major lesson. Markets are shaped by culture, psychology, and power just as much as by supply and demand. Economic textbooks often present markets as neutral mechanisms that efficiently allocate resources based on consumer preferences and production costs. But the spice trade shows us how much more complicated real markets actually are. The high price of medieval spices wasn't just about the costs of production and transport, though those were certainly factors. It was also about artificial scarcity maintained through monopolies. It was about the association of spices with luxury and status, which made people willing to pay far more than the ingredients were worth in any objective sense. It was about information asymmetry. European consumers had no way to know the true source or cost of spices, which allowed merchants to charge enormous markups. It was about cultural beliefs, about the medicinal properties of spices, which created demand based on misconceptions. According to Dr. Fernand Braudel's monumental work Civilization and Capitalism, analysed extensively by economic historians, medieval markets were embedded in complex social, cultural, and political structures. They weren't abstract spaces where rational economic actors made efficient choices. They were messy human institutions shaped by power relationships, cultural beliefs, information constraints, and social hierarchies. Tonight, as you relax, consider how this applies to modern markets. The price of a pharmaceutical drug isn't determined just by the cost of manufacturing it. It is shaped by patent law, by insurance systems, by what pharmaceutical companies believe patients can be made to pay. The price of a college education isn't based primarily on the cost of providing instruction. It is influenced by signaling effects. A degree from a prestigious university signals something to employers, by government loan programs that make higher prices feasible, by an arms race in amenities as universities compete for students. Markets aren't natural phenomena like gravity or thermodynamics. They're human institutions, and they reflect human psychology, culture, and power structures. The spice trade taught us this lesson centuries ago, but we often forget it when we think about contemporary economics. A third lesson from the spice trade concerns globalization and interconnection. The medieval spice trade created a truly global network connecting Europe, the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, and East Africa. This network moved not just spices, but also ideas, technologies, diseases, and people. According to Dr. Janet Abu-Lughod's research in her book Before European Hegemony, the 13th century saw an integrated world system of trade that stretched from England to China, with the spice trade as one of its key components. This medieval globalization had profound consequences. New foods and cooking techniques spread along trade routes. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge developed in India, and the Islamic world reached Europe. Technologies like the compass and improved ship designs diffused across regions, but diseases also travelled these routes. The Black Death that devastated Europe in the 14th century likely came from Asia along trade routes that included the spice trade. Tonight, think about the parallels to our own era of globalization. We live in a world of unprecedented interconnection, where goods, information, money, and people move across borders with a speed and scale that medieval merchants couldn't have imagined. This interconnection brings enormous benefits: access to products from around the world, rapid sharing of innovations, cultural exchange, economic opportunities. But interconnection also brings risks and challenges. Supply chain disruptions, like we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, can cascade globally. Financial crises can spread from one country to another with frightening speed. Climate change is a global problem that requires global solutions, but is difficult to address because it involves coordinating actions across hundreds of countries. Diseases can spread globally within weeks, as we've learned painfully in recent years. The spice trade taught medieval people about both the benefits and the dangers of global interconnection. We're still learning that same lesson today, in different forms. The fundamental challenge remains: how do we maintain the benefits of global exchange while managing the risks and ensuring that the benefits are shared fairly? A fourth lesson concerns the relationship between commerce and empire, between economic motivations and political power. The spice trade wasn't just about individual merchants seeking profits. It was entangled with state power, colonialism, and imperial expansion. According to Dr. Sanjay Subramaniam's research at UCLA, published in his work on connected histories, the Portuguese Estado da Fazendia, the Dutch East India Company, and the British East India Company were all hybrid institutions that combined commercial and political functions. These weren't just trading companies, they were quasi-governmental organizations that built forts, maintained armies and navies, made treaties with local rulers, and governed territories. The pursuit of spices provided the economic motivation for European expansion into Asia, but that expansion quickly became about much more than trade. It became about political control, about territorial conquest, about reshaping societies to serve European economic interests. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, consider how the legacy of this entanglement between commerce and empire continues to shape our world. The borders of modern nations, the languages spoken in different regions, the economic inequalities between different parts of the world, all of these bear the imprint of the colonial era that the spice trade helped to launch. According to research by economists, including Dr. Daron Acemoglu at MIT and Dr. James Robinson at the University of Chicago, published in their book, Why Nations Fail, the institutions established during the colonial period continue to affect economic development today. Countries where colonial powers established extractive institutions designed to extract resources for the benefit of the colonizers tend to be poorer today than countries where more inclusive institutions were established. The spice trade and the colonialism it spawned cast a long shadow. A fifth lesson concerns the moral dimensions of consumption. When a medieval European ate pepper, spiced meat, they were participating in a system that involved exploitation, slavery, violence, and environmental destruction, but they were largely unaware of this. The global supply chain was so long and complex that consumers were disconnected from the conditions of production. Tonight we face a similar situation. When we buy cheap clothing, we're participating in a global garment industry that often involves sweatshop labor. When we buy smartphones, we're participating in a supply chain that may include conflict minerals mined in war zones. When we eat inexpensive meat, we're supporting factory farming systems that raise serious ethical and environmental concerns. Like medieval spice consumers, we're often unaware of or removed from the conditions under which our goods are produced. But there is a crucial difference between medieval times and today. We have the ability to know. We have investigative journalists who expose labor abuses. We have academic researchers who study supply chains. We have certification systems and labels that provide information about how products were made. We have the technological means to trace products from source to consumer. The question is whether we choose to use this information to make more ethical choices. According to Dr. Marion Nessel's work on food politics at New York University, consumer awareness and activism can drive change in how food is produced and distributed. Fair trade movements, organic certification, animal welfare standards, and sustainability initiatives all emerged partly in response to consumer demand for more ethical products. The power isn't absolute. Individual consumer choices face many constraints and limitations, but it is not negligible either. Tonight, think about this. Every purchase is a vote for the kind of world we want to live in. When we buy fair trade coffee or sustainably caught fish or humanely raised meat, we're using our purchasing power to support better practices. When we choose products from companies that treat workers fairly and protect the environment, we're voting for a more just and sustainable economy. It is not a complete solution. Systemic problems require systemic solutions beyond individual consumer choice, but it is one tool available to us that medieval spice consumers didn't have. A sixth lesson from the spice trade concerns the double-edged nature of technological and economic progress. The development of better ships, improved navigation techniques, and expanded trade networks brought genuine benefits. Europeans gained access to a wider variety of foods and flavors. Merchants and investors accumulated wealth that was sometimes invested in productive enterprises. Trade created economic opportunities for some people in both Europe and Asia. But this same progress brought terrible costs. Indigenous populations in the Spice Islands were enslaved and brutalized. Traditional political structures were disrupted or destroyed. Environments were damaged by intensive spice cultivation and deforestation. Local economies were reshaped to serve European demand rather than local needs. According to Dr. Mike Davis's research in his book Late Victorian Holocausts, the integration of Asian and African economies into European-dominated global trade networks in the 19th century made these regions more vulnerable to famines and economic crises. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, think about how this lesson applies to contemporary technological and economic changes. Artificial intelligence, automation, biotechnology, and other emerging technologies offer enormous potential benefits, curing diseases, increasing productivity, solving complex problems. But they also raise serious concerns about job displacement, inequality, privacy, autonomy, and potential misuse. Economic development that raises average incomes can simultaneously increase inequality if the benefits flow primarily to those who are already wealthy. Global trade that increases efficiency can also destroy local industries and communities. Progress in one dimension, technological capability, economic output, doesn't guarantee progress in other dimensions like human well-being, social justice, or environmental sustainability. The spice trade reminds us that we need to think carefully about the kind of progress we want and to make conscious choices about how to shape technological and economic development to serve human flourishing rather than narrow economic metrics. According to the economist Amartya Sen's capability approach, developed at Harvard University and honored with the Nobel Prize, true development should be measured not just by economic output, but by whether people have the capabilities to live lives they have reason to value. A seventh and final lesson from the spice trade is about the enduring importance of narrative and imagination in shaping human action. The spice trade wasn't just about rational economic calculation, it was about dreams and stories. Europeans imagined the Indies as lands of fabulous wealth and exotic wonders. Merchants imagined themselves returning home rich and respected. Explorers imagined finding new routes to legendary kingdoms. These narratives, these imaginative constructions, motivated people to take risks, to invest money, to endure hardships. According to Dr. Lisa Jardine's research at Queen Mary University of London, published in her book Worldly Goods. The Renaissance fascination with exotic goods from Asia was closely tied to a broader cultural movement that valued curiosity, exploration, and engagement with the wider world. The desire for spices was part of a larger shift in European culture toward outward-looking ambition and global engagement. Tonight, think about the stories we tell ourselves about progress, about success, about the good life. These narratives shape our choices just as much as rational calculation does. The dream of wealth and luxury motivated spice merchants. What dreams and narratives motivate us today? The dream of a successful career, of financial security, of making a difference in the world, of creating something lasting, of experiencing adventure and novelty. Our narratives and dreams aren't just individual, they're cultural and collective. We share stories about what success means, about what is worth striving for, about what kind of world we want to create. These shared narratives shape our institutions, our economies, our politics. According to the economic historian Deirdre McCloskey's research at the University of Illinois at Chicago, published in her Bourgeois Era trilogy, changes in cultural narratives about commerce and innovation were crucial factors in the economic transformation that led to modern economic growth. The spice trade was built on narratives, stories about the fabulous East, about brave merchants overcoming obstacles, about the transformation that exotic goods could bring to one's life and status. Some of these narratives were true, some were partly true, and some were fantasies, but they were powerful. They motivated action, shaped institutions, and transformed the world. Tonight, as you drift deeper towards sleep, I want you to think about what narratives will shape our future. Will we tell stories about continued economic growth at all costs, or about sustainable development that respects planetary boundaries? Will we celebrate individual wealth accumulation or collective flourishing? Will we imagine a future of technological progress that benefits everyone, or one where benefits accrue to a small elite? The stories we tell matter. They shape what we see as possible, what we see as desirable, what we're willing to work toward and sacrifice for. The medieval spice trade was shaped by the stories people told about spices and the lands they came from. Our future will be shaped by the stories we tell about progress, prosperity, justice, and human flourishing. Let me bring all these lessons together as we prepare to conclude tonight's journey. The history of the spice trade teaches us about the power of desire, about how markets really work, about the benefits and costs of globalization, about the entanglement of commerce and empire, about our responsibilities as consumers, about the double-edged nature of progress, and about the power of narratives to shape our world. These lessons remain relevant because the fundamental human patterns they reveal haven't changed. We still desire distinction and status. We still construct markets that reflect power and culture. We still live in an interconnected world where distant events affect our lives. We still face the challenge of ensuring that economic activity serves human well-being rather than just accumulating wealth for elites. We still make choices about consumption that have ethical implications. We still need to think carefully about what kind of progress we want, and we still live within narratives that shape our understanding of what is possible and desirable. The spice merchants whose stories I've been telling you tonight, Marco Bellini, Giovanni Contarini, Ibrahim Al-Fassi, Fatima bint Ahmed, and countless others lived in a world very different from ours. They didn't have antibiotics or weather satellites or container ships or the internet, but they faced challenges and choices that would be familiar to anyone today. How do you make a living? What risks are worth taking? How do you balance self-interest with ethics? How do you find meaning and purpose? How do you connect with the wider world? Their answers to these questions played out across centuries and continents through the medium of the spice trade, helped shape the world we live in today. And our answers to similar questions today will shape the world of tomorrow. According to Dr. Timothy Brooks' research at the University of British Columbia, Published in his book Vermeer's Hat, The 17th Century and the Dawn of the Global World, the early modern period when the spice trade was at its height was also when human societies became truly globally connected for the first time. The decisions made during that era about how to structure trade, how to interact with other cultures, what values to prioritize, set patterns that persist today. We have the opportunity, perhaps the responsibility, to examine those patterns and decide whether we want to perpetuate them or transform them. Do we want a global economy that continues the patterns of exploitation and extraction that characterize the spice trade? Or can we create something better trade relationships based on mutual benefit, consumption patterns that account for ethical and environmental impacts, narratives of success that include justice and sustainability? Tonight, as you lie here listening to this story, you are connected to those medieval spice merchants in ways you might not have realized. The black pepper in your kitchen cabinet connects you to the farmers in Vietnam who grew it. The cinnamon in your coffee connects you to workers in Sri Lanka who harvested and processed it. The global trade networks that bring spices to your door are descendants of the trade routes that Marco Bellini and his contemporaries travelled. You are also connected to them by something less tangible, but perhaps more important. You face similar fundamental questions about how to live in a complex, interconnected world where your choices have consequences you can't always see or predict. How do you balance self-interest with concern for others? How do you make ethical choices when information is imperfect and systems are complex? How do you find meaning and purpose in work and consumption? How do you participate in shaping the kind of world you want to live in? These questions don't have simple answers. They didn't in the medieval period, and they don't now, but they're worth thinking about. The medieval spice trade, for all its dangers and moral ambiguities, was also an expression of human curiosity, ambition, and the desire to connect with the wider world. Those are valuable human traits, even when they're expressed imperfectly or even harmfully. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, I hope you'll carry with you a sense of both continuity and possibility. Continuity because the patterns we see in the spice trade, human desires for luxury and status, the complex interplay of markets and power, the benefits and costs of global connection, continue today in new forms. We're still working through challenges and questions that medieval merchants faced, but also possibility, because we're not simply doomed to repeat the past. We have knowledge, tools, and awareness that previous generations lacked. We can study history and learn from it. We can investigate supply chains and make more informed choices. We can create certification systems and regulations to address problems. We can tell different stories about what progress means and what is worth striving for. We can, if we choose, work toward a global economy that is more just, more sustainable, and more aligned with human flourishing. The medieval spice merchants risked everything for pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. Some of them succeeded, and some failed. Some behaved ethically within the constraints of their times, and some didn't. But all of them were part of a vast human story about connection, exchange, ambition, and transformation. You are part of that same ongoing story. Every time you buy groceries, every time you make a choice about what to consume or not consume, every time you support or criticize certain business practices, you are participating in the same fundamental dynamics that drove the medieval spice trade. You are connected to global networks of production and exchange. You are making choices that have distant consequences. You are part of a system that offers both opportunities and moral challenges. Tonight, I hope this story has helped you see those connections more clearly. I hope it has given you a deeper appreciation for the complex history hidden in something as simple as a jar of pepper. I hope it has prompted you to think about the broader patterns and questions that persist across centuries. And I hope it has inspired you to think about what kind of participant you want to be in the ongoing story of global exchange and connection. The spice merchant's journey was long and difficult. Yours doesn't have to be, but it can be meaningful, thoughtful, and connected to the broader sweep of human history. As you fall asleep tonight, Remember that you are part of something larger than yourself, a global human community bound together by exchange, curiosity, and the complicated legacy of people like Marco Bellini, who risked everything for a handful of fragrant seeds from distant lands. Conclusion: sweet dreams from the spice roots. And so, dear friends, we come to the end of tonight's journey through the world of medieval spice merchants. We've travelled from Venice to Alexandria, from Calicut to the Moluccas, from the courts of European kings to the holds of storm-tossed ships. We've met merchants who risked everything for profit, farmers who toiled in spice gardens, sailors who died at sea, and consumers who never knew the full story behind the flavours on their tables. As you settle into your final drift towards sleep tonight, let me leave you with a few last thoughts to carry into your dreams. Think about Marco Bellini, the Venetian merchant whose story opened our journey tonight. Remember how he stood in the Rialto market at age 22, scraping together everything he had, 600 ducats borrowed from family and moneylenders, to buy his first shipment of pepper. Remember his years of struggle, the debts that nearly crushed him, the pirate attack that left him wounded, the plague that took his beloved wife Caterina. Remember also his eventual success, his comfortable old age, and his reflection that the pepper trade had given him both his greatest joys and his deepest sorrows. Marco's story, and the countless similar stories we've heard tonight, remind us that the big forces that shape history, global trade, cultural exchange, economic transformation, are ultimately made up of individual human choices and experiences. History isn't just about systems and structures. It is about people making decisions, taking risks, loving and losing, hoping and striving. Tonight, as your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to drift, remember that you too are making choices that connect you to this long human story. The spices in your kitchen are more than just flavouring. They're links in a chain of exchange that stretches back centuries and circles the globe. Every time you season your food, you are participating in patterns of global trade that have shaped and continue to shape our world. Think about the farmers in India, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and Madagascar who grow the spices you use. Think about the workers who process and transport them. Think about the merchants and traders who connect producers to consumers across vast distances. All of these people are part of your life in ways you might not usually consider, just as you are part of theirs through the choices you make about what to buy and consume. Tonight, let yourself feel the wonder of this connection. In medieval times, Europeans couldn't have told you where their spices came from or who produced them. The supply chain was too long, too complex, too mysterious. Today, we have the ability to know, to trace products back to their sources, to understand the conditions under which they were made, to make informed choices. That is a kind of power and responsibility that Marco Bellini and his contemporaries never had. As you drift deeper towards sleep, think also about the lessons we've drawn from the spice trade. Remember that luxury goods derive their value not just from scarcity, but from the stories and meanings we attach to them. Remember that markets are human institutions shaped by culture, power, and psychology, not natural forces. Remember that global connection brings both opportunities and challenges, both benefits and costs. Remember that commerce and empire have always been entangled, and that the patterns established centuries ago continue to shape inequalities today. Remember that as consumers we participate in systems we don't always understand, but that we have more power to investigate and change those systems than previous generations did. Remember that progress is double-edged, bringing both gains and losses, and remember that the stories we tell ourselves about what is valuable, what is worth striving for, and what kind of world we want to create, these narratives are powerful forces that shape our collective future. Tonight, as you fall asleep, I want you to know that the history of the spice trade isn't just ancient history, it is a living history that continues to unfold. The patterns established centuries ago when merchants first began carrying pepper and cinnamon across oceans still echo in our modern global economy. The questions those medieval merchants faced about risk and reward, ethics and profit, ambition and responsibility, These are questions we still face today, but we face them with advantages they didn't have. We have knowledge, we have awareness, we have the ability to learn from history, we have movements for fair trade, for sustainability, for justice. We have the possibility, if we choose to use it, of creating global exchange systems that are more equitable, more sustainable, more aligned with human flourishing. Tonight, as your mind quiets and sleep approaches, let yourself imagine what that might look like. Imagine a world where spice farmers receive fair compensation for their labour, where working conditions are safe and dignified, where the environmental impact of cultivation is managed sustainably. Imagine supply chains that are transparent, where consumers can know the story behind the products they buy. Imagine a global economy where the benefits of trade are shared more equitably, where the legacy of colonial exploitation is acknowledged and addressed. This isn't just fantasy. These changes are possible. They're happening in small ways already through fair trade movements, direct trade relationships, sustainability initiatives, and consumer activism. The question is whether we'll choose to support and expand these alternatives, or whether we'll continue with business as usual. But tonight isn't the time for worry or anxiety about big global problems. Tonight is for rest, for peaceful sleep, for letting your mind wander through the stories you've heard. As you drift off, let yourself imagine the spice routes, the ships with their billowing sails crossing blue waters, the bustling markets where merchants from different cultures met and traded, the spice gardens where pepper vines climbed up trees and cinnamon grew in the shade, the kitchens where cooks experimented with exotic new flavors. Imagine the moment when a European cook first tasted pepper and felt that sharp, bright heat on their tongue. Imagine the wonder of a merchant seeing clove trees for the first time, their fragrant buds ready for harvest. Imagine the pride of a farmer whose carefully tended cardamom fetched a good price at market. Imagine the relief of a sailor finally sighting land after months at sea, knowing he'd survived the journey and would see his family again. These moments of wonder, achievement, connection, and relief, they're part of the spice trade story too, alongside all the hardship and exploitation. Human history is complex, full of both darkness and light, both cruelty and kindness, both exploitation and genuine exchange. The spice trade embodied this complexity. It connected cultures and facilitated exchange of ideas and goods. It also involved violence, slavery, and environmental destruction. Both things are true. History rarely offers us simple moral narratives. Tonight, as you sink deeper into your pillow, let yourself hold that complexity without needing to resolve it. Let the stories wash over you. Marco Bellini's struggles and triumphs, the five merchants' varied fates, the perils of storm and pirate and disease, the transformation of European cuisine and society, the dark legacy of exploitation, the age of exploration that reshaped the world, the modern echoes that continue today, the lessons we can draw for understanding our own world. Let it all swirl together in that pleasant, unfocused way that thoughts have as sleep approaches. You don't need to remember every detail. You don't need to hold on to every fact and figure. Just let the overall impression sink in, that something as simple as a desire for flavorful food could drive such vast changes in human history, that individual choices aggregate into world-shaping forces, that the past and present are more connected than we usually realize, and that understanding these connections can help us make more thoughtful choices about our own participation in global systems. As your breathing deepens and your muscles relax, as the boundary between waking and sleeping grows thin and fuzzy, let yourself feel gratitude for the complex web of human effort that brings you simple pleasures like seasoned food. Let yourself feel connected to the long chain of farmers, traders, sailors, and merchants who have, across centuries, carried spices across the world. Let yourself feel part of the ongoing human story of exchange, connection, curiosity, and transformation. And now, as you drift into sleep, let me offer you a blessing in the spirit of those medieval merchants who would have prayed for safe voyages and profitable trades. May your dreams tonight be peaceful and pleasant, free from storms and pirates of the mind. May you wake tomorrow refreshed and curious, ready to engage thoughtfully with the complex world you are part of. May you carry with you an awareness of the connections that bind us all together across distance and time. May you make choices that honor both your own flourishing and the flourishing of others. May you participate in writing the next chapter of the human story of global exchange in a way that brings more justice, more sustainability, and more genuine connection. Sweet dreams, friends. May you sleep well, and may the stories of the spice merchants accompany you gently into rest. And when you wake tomorrow and season your breakfast, may you remember for just a moment the long history and the many hands that brought that flavor to your table, and may you feel gratitude and connection to the vast human community of which you are a part. Good night, sleep peacefully, and may tomorrow find you curious and thoughtful about the world and your place in it. Sweet dreams.